Good evening and welcome to the Tuesday, June 24th, 2025 study session of the Olympia City Council. For the record, we have a quorum with Mayor Pro Tem Nguyen excused tonight. So we have 3 items on our agenda this evening for our study session, beginning with agenda item 2A, which is a briefing and discussion on reparations for the descendants of enslaved African people, followed by our Olympia 2045 housing element chapter of the City of Olympia's comprehensive plan update and our housing displacement analysis, as well as the budget sustainability and city's approach to balancing the 2026 operating budget discussion. So we will begin with item 2A on your agenda, which is the briefing on the discussion of reparations for the descendants of enslaved people. And I'll turn it over to Susan Grissom to introduce our guest this evening.
Thank you, Mayor. Good evening, council members. For the record, I am Susan Grisham, Assistant to the City Manager. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I am here with Dane Wolfram and Dr. Ashley Gardner of TrueClusion, and the presentation tonight focuses on the historical context, research findings, input, and a path forward related to reparations for descendants of enslaved African people. Just for a little refresher, on August 13th, 2024, Mayor Payne, with the support of Mayor Pro Tem Nguyen and Councilmember Vanderpool, put forward a referral regarding a study of reparations for the descendants of enslaved African people. The City Council supported moving that referral forward on November 12th, and a resolution was passed on November 12th, and the report that we're discussing today is based on direction from a council to study what other cities are doing regarding this type of work, and to help inform city-level reparations work. And before we dig into the briefing, I'd like to just hand it over to Mayor Payne for some comments.
Thank you, Susan. And welcome, Dane and Dr. Gardner. It's good to see you. Dr. G. So I am really happy to be here at this point and finally having this study session on this issue. We've been talking about it for quite some time now. We passed the resolution as a council back in November of last year. And there are actually a number of actions that we specified in that resolution that we would do. There are 7 particular actions that we said that we would take on. And I'm happy to report that we've completed 1, 2, 3, I should have counted this ahead of time, 4, roughly between 4 and 5 of the 7 of the action items that the resolution calls for. And they are, specifically, they are, number 1, requesting that the state and do what it can to study the issue of reparations. The second is that we encourage our staff to do additional research, hence we have our contractors here tonight to discuss that, our consultants. And then also we talked about encouraging the joining of the Black Home Initiative with King and Pierce counties, which we've also done that, and further discussion along looking at reparative justice as it relates to our various city plans, like our comprehensive plan and so on. And I've certainly been using that lens as I've been doing our reviews of our chapters. And we have another one this evening next on our agenda, which is our housing chapter. And there's certainly sort of like a natural flow to the next agenda item. And so this conversation I really see is something I will carry forward into the next agenda item as well. And I really hope that those who tune in tonight find out a little bit more about what this issue is about and why we're looking at it as a city. Actually, just recently filmed the podcast, or on the city's podcast, to speak more at length about this particular issue. It's been covered very briefly, and I think there's a lot of questions that the community wants to know. And so I hope people will tune in and educate themselves on the issue. And I'm more than happy to have a conversation with anyone, as I'm sure many of our members are as well. I want to first of all thank you in advance, because I look forward to hearing from my council mates on what your thoughts are on this issue. Since we passed the resolution, we haven't had very much time to discuss what our thoughts are, and so I look forward to hearing them. And I want to thank our staff for all the work that's gone into getting us to this point to have the study session. And so I look forward to the presentation tonight.
Thank you, Mayor. So first, what are we trying to solve? At the heart of this work is repair. We're looking at ways to address the generational harm caused by slavery and systemic racism and identify actions that can help descendants of enslaved African people in our community achieve healing, justice, and opportunity. Before we dig into the presentation, I wanted to first touch upon how enslavement is part of our history here in Olympia. I'm speaking of Charles Mitchell's story, which is local and powerful. Enslaved as a child, Charles Mitchell was brought to Olympia and lived just blocks from where we're sitting today. He escaped to freedom at age 13, and that's a reminder of both injustice and resilience. His legacy calls us to acknowledge the past and take action in the present. I think it's important to share a reminder of what reparations are. On this slide, I share the definition of reparations, but overall, reparations are about healing. They're rooted in human rights and seek to repair group-based harms. This can look like direct cash payments, land, housing, education, healthcare, tailored to the specific needs of our community. And I wanted to share a problem statement. Black residents that are descendants of enslaved African people continue to experience the lasting effects of slavery, systemic racism, and policies that have denied them access to wealth-building opportunities, particularly home ownership. For residents who are descendants of enslaved African people, the denial of wealth-building opportunities, especially home ownership, remains a core issue. According to data provided by the Black Home Initiative, approximately 42% of Black households in Washington State have zero net worth, compared to 14% of white households. Black households in Thurston County have the lowest rate of homeownership of any racial or ethnic group. According to the American Community Survey, a five-year estimate for from 2019 to 2023, the homeownership rate in Thurston County for white non-Hispanic households is 70%, while the homeownership rate for Black households is 51%. The same survey estimates indicate this disparity is higher in the city of Olympia, where the homeownership rate for Black households is only 34%. Based on that information, it's no surprise that restrictive covenants were common in Olympia and Thurston County, barring Black communities from owning or occupying homes. These covenants created long-lasting racial segregation and economic exclusion. The county is now actively working to identify and remove these covenants, and the city of Olympia is supportive of that effort. And before I turn it over to Dane and Dr. Gardner, I just wanted to pause a moment here for any questions.
Thank you, Susan. I don't have a question, but I did, since you mentioned the county's program on racially restricted covenants and removal, I wanted to make a clarifying point that this isn't about erasing history for anybody who might be listening and maybe share concerns about that. What it would do, or what the county's program does, is it removes language from the deed so that future sale of the properties, that language doesn't continue forward. So racist language that still exists within the deeds of the homes that exist here in our county. And so it would stop that from moving forward, but certainly preserve the history as it existed in the past. Yeah.
Thank you, Mayor.
Yeah.
Now, with that context, I'll turn it over to Dane and Dr. Gardner to share their research.
Thank you so much. So the first thing I'm going to do is walk you all through how we gathered the data for this reparations project, and then I'll outline the structure of the report that you have in front of you, okay? So that is the process of gathering the entire reparations process, but this specifically is what I'm about to talk about, okay? So to identify U.S. cities engaged in reparations work, we conducted a 2-week comprehensive web search, and this process led us to identify 23 cities actively involved in reparations efforts in the U.S., and using this same method, we identified 24 organizations and 6 counties doing similar work. So to better understand these efforts, we used something called a mixed methods approach to collect the data, which included qualitative interviews, surveys, and a document analysis. And we started by gathering publicly available documents such as city websites, news articles, reports, task force meeting minutes, and city council meeting minutes. So we analyzed all of these materials and identified key personnel involved in each city's reparations efforts. We then reached out to them first by phone to request interviews or survey participation. And if there was no response, we followed up via email. And as a result of this outreach, 12 out of the 23 cities responded, either agreeing to participate in an interview or a survey, or forwarding our request to the appropriate person. So ultimately, 10 individuals from 7 cities completed a survey or participated in a phone interview. And for the cities that remained unresponsive, we relied on the documents collected earlier to gather data on their efforts. Now, to take a closer look at the activity in Washington State, we reached out to 30 cities by phone and email to inquire specifically about their reparations work. Then if we move on to data analysis, if you will, we reviewed thousands of pages of documents and coded the interviews and survey responses to develop this comprehensive understanding that you have in your report. Lastly, once the report was drafted, we conducted something called a member checking technique, by which we sent the report to every city that participated to give them 2 weeks to review the data to confirm its accuracy. So now let's get into just a quick overall review of the report. And so I'm going to reference a few pages in your document so you can follow if you would like. And so first things first, I want to start off with section 1. So this report is divided into several key sections. Section 1 provides a categorical overview of reparations efforts across the cities that we studied. And so these categories that you have in section 1 are the types of reparations that were considered or implemented in these cities, the goals of that were driving these efforts, the timeline, the current stage each city is in, the challenges each city have encountered, eligibility criteria for receiving reparations, and the community's response to these initiatives. And so then if we move on to section 2, starting on page 12 in your document, that then gives you a city-by-city breakdown of reparations efforts for all of the 23 cities. So for each city, one thing that you'll notice is that we indicate the data source in parentheses, whether it came from interviews, surveys, and or public documents. So for example, if we go to page 29, I'll pause. If we go to page 29, you'll find an overview of Evanston, Illinois' reparations efforts. And so we spoke with multiple people involved in Evanston's reparations work, and we reviewed supporting documents. And what we learned about Evanston is that a key focus for them has been building generational wealth through land and housing. And the way they've done that is they made progress through both housing and economic assistance programs, distributing at least $5 million to residents, with $25,000 per person going towards home ownership. And so you can find more details on Evanston and other cities in that section 2, like I said, starting on page 12. It's also worth noting that through our targeted outreach in the state of Washington, we found that the reparations efforts at the city level are relatively limited. However, several organizations based in Washington are actively engaged in reparations work. So again, section 3, starting on page 51, this feels like church, making you go to all of these different pages. I'm so sorry. But starting on page 51, you will find information on organizations involved in reparations work and the brief descriptions of what they've done. And so some examples of these organizations in Washington includes the Urban League of Metropolitan Seattle, the Seattle King County African American Reparations Committee, Washington Equity Now Alliance, the King County Reparations Project, and so on. So we believe these organizations could serve as valuable resources, allies, or potential partners for future work in this space. Lastly, I would like to highlight the feedback we've received from participating cities. So after we sent out the draft to the cities that participated, I then began to get an influx of feedback, unsolicited feedback, by the way, from these cities. And these are some of the things that they said. I'll read a few of them. Thank you for sharing this draft. It is equally impressive and informative. Next, I think this is an excellent report, and you capture the context in our city very well. Is this private? I only ask because I would love to share the final version with our city council and mayor's office. If not, Next, it is heartening to hear reparations work is happening in Olympia, and thank you for the work that you do. And lastly, it's very informative and helpful to hear what other cities are doing. We need to help each other on a national basis. And so, ultimately, what we're going to do is we're going to send this report to all of the cities that were involved in this process, because it seems like they are very happy and excited to hear about this work and really open to collaboration as well, which made Dane and I very excited. And so now I'll pass it to Dane to talk about, really give you a summary of what happened at the Social Justice and Equity Commission meeting.
Or at least the outcomes.
Outcomes.
They had maybe 11 things they wanted to pass on to you. The first ones here, these 6 are specific to reparations, and the next slide are things that, from my understanding of SJEC, was more like globally in the community, right? Not just descendants of enslaved African people. But these are the 6 that they're not necessarily recommending or anything like that. Is just like worth exploring further, were the kind of I think the words. They kind of group together. So the first 3, business operations grant fund, creating business microloan programs, building business startups. Third one, provide grants, funds, and other capacity building to businesses. So those are kind of about building wealth and building wealth through businesses, right? Some of the cities that are, let's say the cities that are under 100,000 that are working on this include like Amherst, Massachusetts, and Asheville, North Carolina. Some of the ones that are a little bit larger, High Point is like 116,000 population. And then you get into larger cities like Providence, San Francisco, and St. Louis. The fourth bullet, monetary, is just like cash payouts. We have not seen that done yet, but the cities that are kind of working on that include pretty much like Amherst actually is kind of, it seems to me that this is where they want to go, but they're really being careful in legal, like making sure that they legally do it and they protect their ability to do it, if that makes sense. So it's almost like, I think the words in the report might be they're waiting to make sure that they can do it. And one of the things is they're waiting for some of the state, like they're actively advocating for their state to open a door, which might make it easier for them, if that makes sense. Because if the state says that, I'll just be specific, so if the state says that reparations is of public service or of public good, then they can say, okay, this is now something we can do. Let's see here. Asheville's doing that as far as cash payments. San Francisco, St. Louis, Evanston to some extent. And some of them are looking at cash, and also I think St. Louis was looking at cash and or tax relief. Mm-hmm. So which is similar to cash, but it's different. And then the bottom 2, which are specific to homeownership, down payment assistance, and also like a loan pool. And I think there's also some like loan pool, or we're working on loans. Down payment, like there's kind of this whole piece of making homes affordable, or assisting in some way getting to that home ownership. The cities, Evanston is doing this. This is what Evanston is doing, pretty much, and they have different ways they're approaching it. One is they're just giving you $25,000 towards a down payment. There's ways that you can get like home repair. If you own your home, it can go repair. It can go like other things, but it's really about home ownership. So they have specific things like that. Evanston is a city of like 75,000. It's not the same as Olympia, of course, but it's similar as far as size. And then every other city, so like Athens, Georgia is looking at this. High Point, North Carolina is looking at this. And Wilmington, those are all kind of that 115 to 150,000 population. And then, of course, St. Louis, and I think that's it. Yeah, those are the ones that are kind of looking at this. This also appears the cities that have been moving forward with reparations. Mm-hmm. Housing seems to be the first thing they're doing. I'm not, don't take too much other than that's just simply a data point. It's not that this is all they're doing. It's not that this is easier or whatever it is. This just seems to be the first thing that has been happening in cities that have been looking at doing many things, but this tends to be the first thing. The next slide, these things I think we're just handing over. Oh, thank you. Oh, thank you. But these aren't really these aren't necessarily reparative to descendants of African enslaved peoples. But I think we just wanted to pass this. So I don't really have notes about this because I'm not sure this is relative to this study session. I think that's it for me.
Can you go back to that slide? Yeah, give a little bit more time for us to.
Oh yeah, sorry.
Thank
If you have questions about it, we were there, and
No worries.
it's in our research. So
Okay. Thank you, Susan.
And before I continue with Path Forward, I just wanted to pause here for questions and conversation.
Thank you. Councilmember Vanderpool.
So I've heard, even before this, I would hear about Evanston's program, and even it got some national news a few years ago. And so I'm very curious, because I didn't look too much into it. How is their tax structure? How are they continuing to have funding for the program into the future?
I think that's the current challenge. Through our research, they told us that funding is the issue because it was being funded through a particular tax, and funding for that is becoming a challenge. So that's where they are right now through my research.
and they will wait list. So what they've done is, I think last year they gave 80 stipends. They have a wait list of 600 or 700 people right now. So there's still the approval process. People are still going through getting validated, or whatever the term you would want, but saying, okay, and then you're next in line. So as funding comes, they're just going to go to next in line. So,
It's slower.
but yeah, so I think they did 80 last year. I don't know how many they've done. I just know that they did 80 last year, and the wait list, if you look, it's public. There's just like numbers, right? You don't know who is who, but it's, I think, somewhere between 600 and 700.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Madron.
Well, first off, thank you so much for gathering this research for us. I know this is a really important step for us to consider in what we might consider here. And thank you to the mayor for really championing this effort both at the city and at the state. My question, so in my previous job, which focused on agricultural issues, one thing that happened in the Biden administration was forgiveness for USDA loans to black farmers. And there's a pretty strong link there in terms of black farmers having been discriminated against by USDA, a long history of that. Yet there was a lawsuit involved in that saying, oh, well, by forgiving loans for just, one, group of people, you're discriminating against everybody else. And I believe that lawsuit prevailed. I don't know if it's stuck somewhere in the system. I understand that Evanston also faced a lawsuit. I'm not sure the status of that. But have you all looked into, some of the legal challenges that come from trying to address past harms and people claiming essentially reverse racism?
So I'll start this, Dane will finish it, but the primary challenge that we found is the way by which they were framed. So, if you say, hey, this is for black residents, for example, that's the issue. Whereas if you say this is for descendants of enslaved peoples, then you won't have those issues. And so through looking at the legal paperwork, well, Dane looked through the legal paperwork a little bit more than me, but that was the problem. So it's just all about framing and making sure that you don't get hit with that reverse racism claim.
And we're not attorneys, right? So
I am not an attorney.
you have counsel, but to that point, like Evanston, the reparation is to black residents between like 1919 and 1969 when the covenants were being, right? Which is, so it's like if you lived in that city and were black in that time, then we're saying you had harm. And I'm not saying that there wasn't, but that's different than you're, you know, an enslaved person. And so, like, they're different and similar, but the lawsuit, it's hard. I think it's going to be. I would hope it would be easier to show harm with someone who is enslaved than just like you were living here. You know, even though I think both are probably true and both deserve reparations probably, but. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, it absolutely helps. Especially the way that it's framed in Evanston of like, if you lived here during this time when these covenants were in place, we can prove that there was harm caused to you. I think it would be harder to say, to be able for somebody to prove necessarily like, that they're a descendant of enslaved people because records were not really, kept very well necessarily. So I'm just trying to wrap my head around, just the complications that come out from folks who are not aligned with wanting to right wrongs in this way.
Yeah, I think the legal challenges seem to be as you scale out, just like all black people, like that gets really hard because now you're giving money away based on race, which probably isn't legal. Again, I'm not a lawyer, but like when we're talking about repairing harm, so what was the harm? And I think the more narrow, and that's like what Massachusetts Amherst is working on, and some other places. I think the more narrow you can say this is what the harm is that we're repairing, then like at least the legal discussion will be narrow.
Yeah, that's why you see other factors too, like income, come into equation, make it income-based. Councilmember Gilman.
Well, first I'm going to add into this. I appreciate this last exchange. It seems to me that while the initial harm is to enslaved people, the consequences really are to all African American people, because the banker or the real estate agent isn't checking your ancestry when they decide to not give you the same deal. So I actually feel really strongly that we don't have to have a genealogy test to show that a person is experiencing racism, or that we have systematically given a different deal in our community to people of color. So and my sense is we can simply make a statement about the harm caused over many generations to the descendants of enslaved people. And then we talk about the demographic reality right now of home ownership, of access to credit, of those impacts that we want to address. So I know there are good lawyers in the world who can finesse that and can challenge it and all that, and they'll have at it. That's fine. But I just feel strongly that we don't need to have individual people proving the harm of their great-great-great-great-grandma. That just seems kind of silly. I think that the report, your comments that you collected from other people, Dr. G, it's a gift to the broader community and to other cities, which I'm really excited, and it's also better for us if we've got 13 other cities who are working alongside of us simultaneously. So I'm really glad for that. And then I just wanted to comment on this last set of items that while I understand wanting to aim the reparations work at direct economic stability, generational wealth building, and around business and home ownership opportunities makes a lot of sense. It won't stop us from taking on other anti-racist actions, which I think, like the ban the box, is not necessarily making reparations, but it is other pro-social, anti-racist ways to make a more equitable community. So I just want to say that's still a really good list. We're not saying we don't want to, we're not Xing out that list. We're saying it doesn't necessarily fit in the reparations project, but it's a super important project and building off of your earlier work for us of the experiences of discrimination. So I want to appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's still a reparative justice policy, right? Even though it's not reparations. The whole you know, all of the work that needs to be done around genealogy and all of that. I don't want to steal Susan's thunder because I believe it's coming up in the presentation, but the budget proviso from the state that was where money was allocated in the operating budget this past session is to study the issue of reparations. And part of that work is for the state to eventually hire someone with consultation with the Commission on African American Affairs with the Department of Commerce to appoint an experienced consultant to do that work of how would you determine the genealogy of someone. I've heard things like, for example, I cannot tell you who my great-grandparents are. I can't tell you who my great-great-grandparents are. So if you are African American and you are in this country and all of a sudden you stop and you cannot continue to trace your lineage back, that is evidence enough that you are a descendant of an enslaved person, most likely.
May I respond?
Sure.
briefly? Just for a very long time in this country, we used the drop of blood measure to determine whether or not somebody was black. And so it's just super frustrating to me if you're going to turn it around to set a higher bar than that. If you've got a drop of black blood in you, then you were impacted. If that's the standard that we held for generations. So I understand that maybe it's the most prudent path is to do the genealogy work, but it just seems like the results of these negative impacts are plain to see in our community and across our country.
Sure. Yeah, and the state will sort that all out as to what criteria will they determine is the best approach. Yeah. I'll turn it back over to you, Susan.
Thank you, Mayor. So just want to touch a little bit on the path forward. What comes next? So the city is already doing repair work. First, in 2023, we partnered with TrueClusion to study experiences of discrimination in Olympia as part of our equity work. There was the establishment of Rebecca Howard Park. We have a formal commitment to participate in the Black Home Initiative's efforts to address housing disparity. And we have a commitment to equity, becoming an anti-racist city, our Social Justice and Equity Commission, our reimagining public safety work, fair housing initiatives, tenant protections, internal diversity, equity, inclusion work, and the use of our equity framework in everything we do now. And then just dovetailing a little bit off what the mayor spoke about, there's now state-level reparations moving forward. During the last legislative session, through a budget proviso, $300,000 was put forward to fund the Charles Mitchell and George Washington Bush Study on Reparative Action for Washington State, named after our Charles Mitchell. The study will take place between 2025 and 2027 and will produce detailed policy proposals that will be a roadmap for implementation. So the study analyzes the lasting impact of slavery and state policies on the direct descendants of enslaved African people and is exploring reparative remedies like direct payments, education investment, economic opportunity programs, and criminal justice reform. And we are going to be sharing our study with the folks who are doing that work to help inform what they do. So I feel like we're giving them a bit of a head start. So next steps, we'll be having some facilitated conversations with staff to determine connections to our plans, our Olympia Strong, Fair Housing Assessment, Comp Plan, which a lot of that work is already being done with an equity lens, but just taking any feedback and thoughts the council has and making sure we're overlaying that over everything. And taking your feedback and moving forward, any specific city scale things that you want to have stood out today that you would like to move forward, and just continuing to collaborate with the state, the county, and other partners related to reparations and repair work. And that's it.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank you again, Dr. G and Dane, for all of your work. I think it was expressed already quite well that clearly there are people that are excited about this work. We thank you for capturing what their thoughts are, and it's good to know that we're not by ourselves in Washington, so thank you for that. Councilmember Green.
All right. Thank you both so much for this work. It's clear, I mean, it's obvious from the requests you had from some of the other cities, even just the demand for this type of analysis. I'm wondering if you could share, or if there were any takeaways from your conversations with the few cities you did get to talk to. So one of the things I spent a lot of time with on the Section 2 on the cities, and one of the things that jumped out at me was how many either are on these incredibly long, slow timelines, or just absolutely clearly have come to a dead stop. Were there any cities willing to share? I mean, I have some assumptions about why that is. Were there any cities willing to share, particularly the ones that have continued to move this work, how they have done that when so many cities have hit whatever roadblock? I'm going to guess it involves politics. But were there any takeaways from those conversations specifically around how cities were sustaining this work?
Yeah, so the insight from the cities that sustained the work and the ones that stopped and provided their challenges were consistent. It really came down to, from the research, was just internal consistency. Because the primary challenges from the cities that stopped were group dynamics, internal group dynamics, right? Staying focused, not having goals. Some council members phase out, and the people that phased in just weren't into it. And so from what I learned, it was purely internal. I didn't see much about the public and the community's response and things like that. It was a lot of internal issues that really paused the things. And the ones that moved forward, they were just really consistent. They were on top of it. And yeah, so that was generally what I found, largely internal things.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Councilmember Cooper, followed by Councilmember Madrone.
Thank you, Mayor Payne. Thank you both for the study. It was echoing my colleagues. It was really a pleasure to read and neat to know that so much has advanced in conversations around the country. I just spent the last year paying reparations for the state of Washington at work. Through the Community Reinvestment Plan, we spent $300 million doing reparations, $200 million doing reparations, not just me, mine was a small piece of that, but doing reparations for Black, Latin, and Native people who were disproportionately harmed by the war on drugs. So the violence, the mental health, the income, that all came from that. And I will say, to Councilmember Madrone's point, the hardest thing is getting the money to the population that is supposed to be getting it. And the worst people to do that is government. And so we found when the workforce development system was putting money out to people to target populations, they might be able to hit 50% of the target population in King County, so 30-something statewide, versus when nonprofits were doing the reparation payments directly to buy-in for organizations and individuals, the target population was met at 100%. And that's just by having people identify as Black, Latin, or Native. So I think that's a really important aspect, that this is not, any programs that we do, unless it's like a utility bill, kind of a tax alleviation, then I would say we need to have community partners who are working with buy-in for organizations and with Black people in community, and that government would be an abject failure at doing a lot of the things on this list. In my experience, now you can braid government funding and have an awesome program. And so I want to point out a couple of things that aren't on this list. So the lowest hanging asset fruit for Black people in our community are actually doing their taxes. So doing their earned income tax credit and their working families state tax credit. That's the lowest hanging asset fruit. And so how can we make sure that there's voluntary tax preparation available across our community for descendants of slaves? And frankly, I think we can do things that are reparative that also benefit everyone else, right? And so thinking about the taxes was the thing that we did statewide that benefited everyone else, but we targeted the marketing and messaging on the target population. Public benefits as well. There's a lot of public benefits that people don't know, they can't find. They're kind of held in that lower income place, and they're working a couple jobs, and they're struggling with just getting food on the table, let alone being able to do all the paperwork and find the government program. And so in Tacoma, and now in 3 places across the state, or 4 now, we have things, and this is not run by me, but by other organizations, that are called financial opportunity centers. And a financial opportunity center would have financial coaching, mental health peer counseling and workforce development all in one site. And if you're really lucky to have funding, like we did with the Community Reinvestment Program, you also offer a match savings account to every individual that walks in the door. So you can save $1, we'll give you another $1, and you can use it for a house, you can use it for a car, you can use it for a business, or to buy down your debt. And that kind of a match savings account we found with just a very small amount of money went really, really far. And we were thinking, oh, $10,000, people will save it. And they we're not hearing from them. And then came tax day, and all of a sudden people had a little bit of money and they could do their match. But we found that people actually met better at like a $1,000, $3,000, or $5,000 place for saving, for quick savings, so that they could get into that car or whatnot. I know I'm talking a lot, but I just really have a high passion for this kind of a bundle, and I can see that it works. In Washington State, for mental health peer counseling, the Northwest Credible Messengers started the Barber and Beauty Shop Behavioral Health Project. They went and trained 100 barber and beauty shop people, workers, owners, to be peer counselors. And so now the person that you talk to the most regularly about the most things is actually a mental health counselor and can help you in the barber chair, which it's been having huge results across Washington. And then lastly, we did direct mini grants for small businesses that were led by the populations of color and nonprofits. And what was really interesting is we approached that wanting to do technical assistance for them, like thinking, the big government thinking that they needed help with, dotting I's and crossing T's. But what it comes down to is like actually needing a couple bucks for a thing before you can talk about anything else, right? And so the best example is a health clinic in Spokane wanting to do HIV counseling on telehealth, and they didn't have any laptops. Right, and so you have to get a laptop in the hands of the client so that you can do a good, private, secure telehealth meeting. And so I think that in those spaces, the city could do a lot. There's models where United Way or LISC or other community nonprofits are holding and partnering with Goodwill and Workforce Development to build these kinds of centers which are focused on target populations in a neighborhood. And I just want to say that I'm all in, and I want to see the city try to build out some of this programming. But the first thing we can do is help people get their taxes done.
Thank you, Councilmember Cooper. That's, substantive.
And frankly, I'm sorry to just add, like, we really should bring Corbett Mosley or someone from the Department of Commerce to come in and talk about the Community Reinvestment Plan, because it really lays out what reparations can be and should be statewide. It just is focused on a different slice of a harmed population.
Sure. I figured we would give Commerce some time to figure out who they're going to hire, and then that would make sense to bring someone like Corbett in. Thanks. Councilmember Madrone.
Well, appreciate all the ideas there, Councilmember Cooper. As I think through all of this in terms of, what we could be working on here in Olympia, I think about, if we tie something to a very specific harm, racially restricted covenants, a very specific barrier for access to home ownership. We've signed on to the Black Home Initiative saying that we are committed to supporting Black home ownership. And so I think that's a space that we could really lean into and, make good on this commitment that we've made. I'm not entirely sure what it looks like. Obviously the support around down payments or home repair or something like that sounds appropriate. And we would need some kind of dedicated revenue. We've got a conversation later today around our budget shortfall and how we're going to address that. So I think, of course, we're thinking long-term here. And I think it's also worth mentioning that there's no amount of work or resources that the city of Olympia can provide that would undo all the harm that has been caused. But I do think that there are steps that we can make in the right direction. And so that's kind of where my mind goes in terms of something that we could be working on for the city of Olympia, because we've already said that we would. It's just about figuring out, how we do it and how we can establish some kind of dedicated revenue. So we don't end up in a place, Evanston has done incredible work, and now they're like, oh, we're out of money. What's next? So there's that. And in that vein, in terms of things that we've already been working on, things that we have, are planning to continue to work on, that doesn't cost us anything, is our work around tenant protections. I just want to note that, we're going to have a series of study sessions this year looking at the whole universe of tenant protections that are changing at the state, what we've done locally, and what we might do next. Screening policies is on that list. And I just want to lift that all up because I know that that's a tough conversation to have with some of the sentiment, that we've been hearing around it. But, we've talked about sometimes like, oh, do we have the data that shows the impact? And, we're not always going to have that data, but we know where our values are. And so I just want to lift that up, in terms of work that that's right there in front of us, that we could do that, again, not necessarily in the realm of reparations with that one, but it doesn't cost us anything. So, it is forward moving process on, reparative justice. So.
Thank you. Councilmember Vanderpool.
I agree. I think that thinking about where we are with housing and with the lens of this work, but I also think of and I'm wondering while you were doing your studies if you ran into a little bit of this, is some of the ideas I have around climate change is thinking of the neighborhoods and the communities that are underserved historically over time. African American communities all over this country, and they're being affected by climate change worse off than other communities because they don't have the same investment and resources. And I'm very curious if any of that lens came up in your work. And I'm also interested in the idea of additional to the housing question is, so I'm aware that on the East Coast and the Midwest, there's a lot of cities that have traditionally Black-owned banks that have loan systems that are usually not traditionally supported by governments. And I always think about ways in which we can build up home ownership through stuff like examples of stuff like that. But I also agree about the funding in the future, thinking about how do we ensure that there's supportive funding in the future if we establish a program? Because I want a program to be successful, and I don't want us to be in a position where we create a program and then we run out of funds and there's a whole bunch of people on the list who need to be served, right? And I think I like the idea of holistically looking at a neighborhood and not just the housing in it. I think about the housing repair and improvement. I think of climate resiliency for that neighborhood, but I also think of, like I said, the repair, the climate resiliency. I think of access to sidewalks, other equity things that make a neighborhood last for generations. So, yeah.
Thank you. Councilmember Gilman.
Thank you. I'm sort of bursting with passion around this. And so even though our U.S. president kind of broke the sound barrier this morning with profane language, I'm going to work to respect and elevate this conversation, keep my dignity here, even though I'm ready to just... I think that I would sort out separately the good things that we're doing to lessen ongoing harm, like the tenant protections. I think that all needs to continue. And some of what was on that second page list were really additional consumer or tenant protections. And that to me is about continuing to try to undo the ongoing racism, because we don't want to pretend that we're doing reparations about something that used to happen, right? So we want to continue efforts to reduce ongoing harm. And then for the reparations, I think we began the relationship with the Black Homeownership Initiative. We had a strong showing of people from the Thurston County Realtors coming to say, let's partner. I would like to put energy sort of narrowly into that while we have the state do this initial work that you really helped to get initiated. And I'm hearing lots of reality checks about that Evanston program, and just the math in my head is that $25,000 a person, and they spent $5 million. That was 200 people. So, and they have hundreds to go yet in their town. Is that 200? No? I'm not talking, sorry. Oh, okay. I think it's 200, 5 million divided by 25,000. So $5 million doesn't go as far as you might think, and $5 million isn't something we happen to have right now. Anyhow, that's just a reality check about just straight up cash reparations. Seems like a really bold and right thing to do, and it's also not a resource that we have in the way that our own revenue generating is structured right now. So it'd be great if we can get to that because I would prefer that any sort of reparations have the least strings attached. That we, especially as Councilmember Cooper was pointing out, that by and for organizations administering some resources are probably more likely to reach people and less likely to over-prescribe and set a whole bunch of criteria that we would feel obligated to do. So I just thank you so much for bringing this to us today, and I'm ready to keep working on it.
Thank you. Councilmember Cooper.
Thank you, Mayor. One other thing, and I think this came up, but I just want to emphasize, I really think we need to write our harm statement and make a really clean, the preamble for whatever the work is done here. And I just also thinking about how much direct connection there is to the Olympia Strong plan and like, I would guess like 75% of the things in this study that we've been given. And so thinking about how to have a nexus every time we're working in that space to make sure that we're looking at the most disaggregated data, the people that are the most underserved in our community. And then I think that will help us get to this target population as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's exactly the intent of our resolution that we passed, is for us to do that kind of deep analysis. Couple things. Might go on a little long here, so I'm just gonna say that in advance. So, couple of things based on what I'm hearing from council. First of all, reparations is direct cash payments, but it's also other things. However, we're not in a position at this time as a city to provide direct cash payments. In addition to that, our other municipalities around the state, around the country, there's really nobody that has gone first other than Evanston, right? And they're being challenged with a lawsuit based on what they've done. And so you have other cities kind of watching to see what the outcome of that decision will be. I think they're being accused of violating the 14th Amendment of the Constitution for having a race-based program. So I think that you have your individual actions that you take, which are things like direct cash payments. Those are the things that people can see, touch, and feel around their kitchen table, in their house. They see it in their bank account. They feel it in the assets that they have. It directly contributes to their household. That is an individual action. And then there's the collective action. And those are the things that we do that are a form of reparations, but they're not something that people benefit directly from in terms of how their household benefits. An example of that would be like our Rebecca Howard Park project. It is literally a park for peace and healing. And what is the opposite of healing? Harm, right? And so in many ways, that is a reparative justice project that our city is doing. But it is not an individual action where people can feel that in their own homes, right? And so I think those are the separate categories by which we need to be thinking about the different policies. There's also, I think, the need for us to identify what is our low-hanging fruit and what are some longer term actions that we could take, similar to what we've done with Olympia Strong. So we have, we're in the same situation with Olympia Strong, which is that we don't have a dedicated funding mechanism or source for Olympia Strong. So, but we have, staff has worked on figuring out what are the things that we could do in the near future and what are the things that are more long-term and who would we work with to achieve those particular projects or actions that have been identified are also there. So for me, I think things like looking at our direct cash payment is a long-term policy approach. And that, for me, is very important because I think first and foremost, that's what this is. It's direct cash payment and then it's everything else. But we are not there. So what do we do and what's our part in the meantime? And in addition to those direct cash payments, the state is really the ones that have to lead the way for cities to have some guidance on how we even would pursue that to begin with. So that's kind of like step A before anything else can even happen in that regard. I think it was mentioned earlier, Dana, I think it was you who mentioned that, the state needs to, they'll take action and then other cities, will kind of watch and follow suit. And that's exactly what will need to happen when it comes to that kind of direct compensation. But that doesn't let cities off the hook because we're responsible for redlining and racially restricted covenants and all of these things that local government enforced racist federal policies, probably the most, right? And so how do we participate in all of the different actions, specific actions that, or harms that we've done to repair those? Racially restrictive covenants is one of them. The next is how do we address the lack of, well, we have a new housing chapter. And so how in our comprehensive plan that is required, and I went through that and you'll hear me mention in a moment, but there is no particular mention of what we will do in that space of reparations in terms of establishing a home ownership goal for Black residents, which is something our resolution also calls for, which is for our city to determine what that goal is. And that is based on information that we understand, right? What is the current rate of home ownership for our Black residents? How does that compare against our white residents in our community? What's that disparity? I've seen numbers online, many of which I'm skeptical of, which is why I haven't mentioned them, because I see different numbers in different places, using different years, and looking at all of that is clearly all of the numbers that I've looked at indicates a disparity, but the accuracy of what's being reported is mostly what I'm concerned with. So we need to do some digging there, and based on that information, determine what makes sense in terms of goals for us to establish that. And again, that's what our resolution calls for, is for us to establish that home ownership goal. And work towards it, which is something that I think could be spelled out in our housing comprehensive plan chapter. Back to direct cash payments really quickly. So if anyone's wondering what that would look like in the future when the state is doing the work or they have completed the study, and we have that information in front of us of the criteria has been determined, and all of those questions that are still out there, what would come next? Well, what would come next would be to pursue specific legislation that would permit direct cash payments. And then essentially you would have municipalities that would support that, at the state level. So that would be what would happen next if people were sort of like unclear about, well, where would this all go? My biggest fear is that, that this is treated as a study that will sit on a shelf somewhere. And the Black residents of Washington are not going to let that happen because they are taxpayers who are contributing to this state in ways that are immeasurable, and yet there's still so many disparities that exist for us within the state that are going unaddressed by our state government and by our local governments. And so that needs to be rectified. And then, I just want to say that there's a few things I think in the short term that we've identified today that I've heard. Things like, again, establishing a home ownership goal, developing our statement, our problem statement more clearly and tying that to a specific harm. That's a great first start. We know what those harms are, but it'd be great to tighten it up and make it more specific. Look at our comparable plans, our comprehensive plan, our capital facilities plan, all of those plans, Olympia Strong, and making sure that we're really digging in and breaking down in terms of how those broader equity goals are touching upon Black residents specifically. And then there's also something that I wanted to mention around what is not reparations, in my opinion. And you'll see in this report, there's a number of things that cities have done that I frankly don't consider reparations. And maybe it's because I have more education to learn more about, but things like a private fund. A private fund is not reparations, in my opinion. And the reason that it is not is because you have individual citizens or people contributing to a pot of money that would then be disseminated to Black community members. Reparations is not charity. It's a reparative justice policy approach, and it's the government owning up to what it's done. And so a private fund, in my mind, is not reparations. Loans are not reparations. So if it has to be paid back, again, not something that is really tied to addressing the harm that's been done. And in fact, when we talk about loans, we're often discriminated against from obtaining them. So I don't have a lot of confidence or faith in that approach. So those are things that, again, I'm open to hearing more about how, people think that they could work, but frankly, I don't see them as a form of reparations. What I do think is reparations are things like direct cash payments, the city assisting in ways to establish a home ownership goal with the intent that our Black residents would become homeowners, thereby having intergenerational wealth that contributes directly to their household and their families for them to pass on that generational wealth that we were robbed of as a result of our ancestors' free labor. So those are things that are reparations. And so I think tonight's conversation will really shape up what we do next in terms of really solidifying where we go from here and how we take what we've talked about and incorporate that really into a lot of the things that we're doing. So we wouldn't necessarily call it equity work, because I think it needs to be identified as this is what we're doing in terms of reparations. Because reparations is not all general equity work. If it's everything, it's nothing. So we need to call it what it is, and not be afraid to use the word either. So I feel strongly about that as we're looking at our plans, as we're looking at different projects, that we are using the word reparations, reparative justice policy, to speak very specifically and to communicate more broadly about this is what we're doing to address this particular subject, to move the needle forward for how we're going to improve the lives of Black residents who have disparities and disproportionate impacts to them in our city. So, Any more questions? Yes, City Manager Murney.
Well, just on that, just one of the things I wanted to highlight that Dr. G said is that the cities that did well set goals and had check-ins and had things along the way, so it didn't become this overwhelming thing. You had ways to check yourself, and so I think we definitely need to follow that. And as we think about work plans in the successive years, we digest this document and figure out what are the things that we can work on now, what are the things that become part of our work plan conversation, so we break this into the chunks and the low-hanging fruit and the longer-term things. So we as a staff will spend some time with this. This won't be the last conversation we have with the council around it, and the community around it as well. And we'll spend some time with it and come back to you with some of those recommendations. So I just really want to highlight that because I think it's a really important piece, like it is with all of our documents like this, is that we have the check-ins and the goals along the way.
Thank you, Jay. Councilmember Gilman.
So if I speak briefly, can you come up with another last word so you can still wrap us up? I don't mean to take that away, but I was inspired when you were speaking that this issue of who are we talking about helping do the repair. Two experiences I've had. One is if you ride a bus from the state capitol campus going to Tacoma or going towards Hawks Prairie at 5 o'clock, guess what the demographics are on that bus? Right. And so we have many African American, black people who commute in every day, who work, play, eat here, but they don't sleep here. And that's because of our historic practices. That's not by choice, right? And so the question of limiting it to residents, frankly, we don't have citizenship of the state or the city. So I would ask that we have a different sort of definition of who our programs might serve rather than people who have a mailing address in Olympia, because part of the point of trying to get to these reparations is to allow people who want to live here to have an opportunity to live here and to build wealth here. So that's a little piece that challenges me. And then the other thing I'd add that's similar to that is with my political hat on, I have access to voter rolls, right? And if you look at where most likely black folks are, it maps, the heat map looks exactly like where the apartment complexes in Olympia are. And that just shouldn't be, all right? So I would challenge the idea about basing our efforts around people with a mailing address in Olympia, because I don't think that's the community necessarily that we want to serve. And I know Thelma Jackson has come and said that in this room many times over the years. So.
Yeah, it's a really great point. And it's a great point because City of Olympia was incorporated 1859. City of Lacey is 1966. So 2 years later, the Fair Housing Act was passed. So the history of racially restricted covenants in our city has had way more of a significant impact. And that's why you do see more black residents in Lacey. It's not just human behavior where people want to be amongst people who are the same, although there are some social factors that play into that too. But it's also because of our racist history in our city of literally banning black people and other people of color from living in our city. And it occurred to me that it also might be why it took us 164 years to have a black mayor, because we were purposely excluding black people from living in our city. So that's a great point, because a lot of people who want to live here now live there. Yeah. Councilmember Vanderpool.
So this reminds me of what was talked about earlier about being very narrow in scope, right? If we're thinking about who is this program for, if we start a program, right? I think about like redlining as an example of that in Olympia, right? So if it was a program around redlining, we have to think about like who lived here when the redlining existed, and are their descendants still, like, would they be able to use the program if they don't live in Washington State anymore, right? Or they don't live in Olympia anymore? Are they still here, or are they in Lacey? Are they somewhere else in the country? Could there be, I mean, this is kind of I'm thinking about the families of those folks who were denied here, and how can we look that up? How can we find out that information about those who were denied here if it's around, for example, redlining in our community? And I'm just thinking out loud about that, right? Where would we set the scope on that? And in your research, did you ever find that there was a bit of some cities that between a certain year and another year, which was brought up before, did you end up finding some people that used to live in a city and then they're living somewhere else now and then they're coming back? Or I'm just curious.
It's one of the things that noteworthily wasn't in there. And one of the things that we didn't find that I like to add as an internal caveat when we're talking about is, was there harm in not being able to move here? Right? And how do you know who that was? Especially thinking about the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, when black folk needed places to go, this was not a city that necessarily was welcoming. And so, was it just harm done to people who lived here, even if it was redlining, and they had to live in that neighborhood, not this neighborhood? Or was there harm done to people who would have liked to have lived here but couldn't? And so it's something that we did not find. And so it's hard to quantify, but it was something that noteworthily we noticed wasn't in the report. Mm-hmm. And I think that's an interesting piece, hearing about a harm report. It would be interesting to look at, like we were talking about with the harm report, is what was the harm done to folks who didn't live here but work here? Or now what's the ongoing harm, right? A harm report would be a really tricky thing for Olympia to do, but it could be a very, very valuable and interesting thing. And I would hope that it wasn't just limited to people who lived in this street and couldn't live on this street, because we know that there's a reason why in 1970 there was I think it's 1970. There was only 16 households or something. Even then, it's really, the numbers up until 1970 in the city were really, really low, mm-hmm. And it probably wasn't just home ownership. It was probably the way the street, the experience being in the city.
Mm-hmm. So there's the harm report, and then there is our experiences of discrimination report, which you've already done for us as well. So I'm not entirely sure, Councilmember Vanderpool, that digging that deep is really necessary. And the reason I say that is because there are things that are happening right now as we speak to people in our community. I believe in your report it was something around 91% of African American respondents or black respondents said that they experienced some form of discrimination in Olympia. So it's present, and so we don't necessarily need to tie it to a historical harm in that way in order to demonstrate the persistent legacy of the institution of chattel slavery. So we're talking about, there's the institution of chattel slavery, which is over, and then there's the institution of slavery, in my mind, which is still continuing. So that looks like mass incarceration, voting, purging voters, police brutality. All of that is the result of a legacy of slavery. And so I want to make sure that we're not thinking of reparations as only addressing historical or past harms. It's also about addressing the present that we're in. And I don't think you need to tie too much to that to draw those conclusions on why it's justified. So, okay. Any other questions or comments? Well, thank you. I know this was a lot of work, so I just appreciate you really digging in. I will say that, and I've said this before, that we're planting seeds on this issue. It is a long-term one. There will be different people sitting in these seats maybe some of us will still be here, but there'll be different people in these seats that I think will still be talking about this issue and moving forward. And we're just the pioneer, so to speak, this council, of being the first ones to bring the issue and introduce it to the city. And I'm hoping that we can do our part with the time that we've been given to keep doing more. And then we can pass the torch to the next council, and that they can keep moving forward. And hopefully the state is doing its part as well, so that we can then be partners to them, and hopefully eventually get to a point where we are providing those direct cash payments to people, because ultimately that is the end goal. But it's not the starting point, unfortunately, despite the fact that we've been waiting for over 165 years at this point for this to happen. It's a long journey that we have been on, and that we'll continue to be on, and we'll continue to champion until justice is served. And that looks like in the form of reparations for the descendants of African people who have intergenerational wealth to pass on to their families, which hopefully will close many, many, many of these economic disparities or disproportionate impacts to Black communities in healthcare and education and housing and all of these ways that we're always at the bottom, and we like to pretend that we don't understand why. And so much of that is tied to money and economic disparity. And we need to we're doing all of this broader equity work, but we will continue to face these challenges until we admit what we've done and pay for it. So thank you again. And Dr. G, I'm going to call you out specifically because you flew all the way here from the East Coast just to be here for this study session tonight, and I so appreciate that. So thank you for flying all the way out. Yes, and we'll be in touch if we have any more questions. And again, this report, we do intend to share it with the state, hopefully with Commerce and with the Commission on African American Affairs. And even though it's specific to municipal actions, hopefully it will give them some sense of how they can work with municipalities on the subject of reparations, and look at some of the actions that other municipalities are doing to help shape maybe what the state will do eventually. So, thank you. Thank you. Yes, Councilmember Cooper.
So just as you're closing, I'm thinking about another next step, which is when we send the report to all of these cities, maybe there's an action to come together and talk to each other and share, because you could really do advocacy together at a national level with this list of cities and kind of grow a coalition to be able to have some meaningful advocacy work across federal and states.
Yeah, I'm there. I'm thinking about it a lot because some of the reparations coalitions that I've seen, I'm not sure how active they are. They seem like they've done a lot of work in the past, but not sure what they're doing now. So, yeah, it's a good point. Thank you. All right. And thank you, Susan.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So we will move on to our next agenda item, which I think will be certainly a relevant topic following our reparations conversation, which is item 2B on your agenda, and it is the Olympia 2045 Housing Element Chapter of the City of Olympia's Comprehensive Plan Update and our Housing Displacement Analysis. And we have our presenter, Casey Schaffler, as well as, who is the Associate Planning in our Community Planning and Economic Development Department, and Krista Lenson, who is our Senior Housing Program Specialist in Community Planning and Development. Good evening, everybody.
Thank you, Mayor. I think we'll wait just a moment so we can get the slide deck up and running. Oh, there we go. May I have the clicker? Thank you. So thank you all very much for having us here tonight. My name is Casey Schaffler. I'm an associate planner with Community Planning and Economic Development. And here with.
Krista Linson, I'm the Senior Housing Program Specialist.
So we're here to talk to you tonight primarily, oh, and Susan, please.
I'll go ahead and introduce myself. Susan McLaughlin, Community Planning Economic Development Director. And since I have the opportunity, sorry, Casey,
No,
since
please.
you gave me the mic, I was just going to say, as was mentioned in the previous agenda item, this is a natural flow from the last conversation, and we hope to have really meaningful dialogue around the housing displacement work. But I also wanted to note, and Casey will also say, that the housing element, this will be the first time the council is seeing it. It's still early days, and so it hasn't gone to the land use committee yet either. So it has a longer journey. So the conversation today will largely be focused on the housing displacement study and how we can really weave that in to the housing element. So I appreciate the comments earlier relative to that.
Sorry about that. So since the last time we discussed this, we've published a draft on May 9th. So that was the first publicly available housing draft, and that is out there now. We've since received the displacement analysis on June 6th, so it is, I would say, relatively hot off the press. We had some previous versions. We asked the consultants to do some revisions. So the draft or the displacement analysis that before you tonight reflects some of those changes that the jurisdictional partners asked to have them updated. We've also already briefed the Planning Commission on the draft chapter. They saw the previous draft version of the displacement analysis, so they haven't even seen this particular displacement analysis tonight either. We did present to the Youth Council as well on May 21st. Again, they saw the draft displacement analysis and the draft chapter. I will note that that group of young persons was really keenly aware of redlining and had lots of questions about our history of redlining in Olympia. And we actually were at Social Justice and Equity Commission yesterday evening. So I would say that they're the first group to have actually reviewed this displacement analysis going forward. So that's kind of where it's been and where we're at this point. So moving right along. I'm going to rehash a few things. It might be new for some folks, but I'll try to be brief and get to the displacement analysis. So it's important to recognize that the city does not control the housing market. We don't control the cost of materials or financing, or whether a property owner wants to sell a piece of property, but we can influence it through policy and regulations, such as the Middle Housing Initiative and Olympia Municipal Code updates, investments and partnerships, such as those with the Low Income Housing Institute, Habitat for Humanity, the faith-based community, and our regional jurisdiction partners. We can influence it through planning and civic engagement through things such as our Housing Action Plan, which is reflected in the draft chapter, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, as well as legislative advocacy as evidenced by the many bills passed at the state level, really just in the last 2 to 3 years. There's been a lot of big changes. So solving housing affordability is going to take action across the whole industry. So that's something that we kind of have to temper with a lot of our community members, is that we can only influence, but we won't be able to solve this on our own. So as you know, the comprehensive plan is the overarching goal and policy document that helps us plan for growth and guides everything that the city does. A really important part of the comp plan are the community vision and values. Based on community input going into the Housing Action Plan, the One Community Plan, the Housing Displacement and Racial Disparity Analysis, and other feedback received throughout the Olympia 2045 update, this values and vision statement hopefully captures the spirit and intent of what our housing chapter should be and map the city's course for future development. And I will highlight that vision statement there. Susan asked me to make sure that we really emphasize that as a key part of this chapter. So if one of the questions, and kind of the question throughout this discussion tonight, is what are we missing? What needs changing? what will better reflect the needs of our community going forward. So really looking at that statement and the other values that you see there. There's obviously other texts that go along with those bullet points, but for brevity, we'll move on. So, a bit of background and, like I said, a refresher on what is required in the housing chapter as part of this update. House Bill 1220 was passed by the state legislature in 2021, and it requires that local governments plan for and accommodate housing affordable to all economic segments, promote a variety of residential densities and housing types, and encourage preservation of existing housing stock. The amended law also directed the Department of Commerce to project future housing needs for jurisdictions by income bracket and made significant updates to how jurisdictions are to plan for housing in the housing element of their comprehensive plans. So HB 1220 defines 7 income brackets and housing types that we must plan for. Those are listed here on this table. I'll note that emergency shelter or shelter for temporary shelter for individuals or families that are currently experiencing homeless. Emergency housing are temporary accommodations for individuals or families at imminent risk of becoming homeless. Permanent supportive housing is low barrier, subsidized housing with supportive services to help tenants maintain housing stability. HB 1220 does not require cities and counties to plan for households earning more than 120% of the area median income. So the area median income, that's set by Housing and Urban Development, and they estimate it as a 4-person household with 2 income earners. And for some context on area median income for our area, the average wage for somebody in accommodation or food services, their annual individual income is $27,000 a year. A manufacturing position would be approximately $64,000 annually, and a state government employee would be $80,000 annually. You'll note that even at that state government role, if you're an individual earner, you're just barely into the moderate income and more likely wavering on the low income category. So I'm able to report Olympia has taken many steps already to implement the intent of the bill, HB 1220, and the requirements of the housing chapter. Examples include the missing middle and the ongoing middle housing updates to Olympia Municipal Code, the adopted housing action plan, and many emergency housing initiatives led by the homeless and housing response team. That said, 2 items are significant updates for us in this chapter. The first is the housing land capacity analysis and the projections outlined at the start of the new housing chapter. I won't dwell too long on this. Council did receive a briefing on this directly from our colleagues at Thurston Regional Planning Council, but I will just note a couple of things here. Capacity, in particular, refers to the potential number of new dwelling units that could be built on a parcel based on the underlying zoning, development regulations, development trends, and market factors. Capacity includes greenfield development, infill development, and redevelopment. Again, for context and review, I would remind you that TRPC forecast for Olympia shows that we have an overall surplus of capacity based on buildable lands and zoning regulations. This surplus appears largely dependent on redevelopment of areas in the downtown core and the west side, and new development in our urban growth areas. Excuse me, I'm sorry, folks. So the housing needs analysis projects that Olympia and its urban growth area will require approximately 14,000 new housing units by 2045 to accommodate population growth. Additionally, a key finding in the needs assessment is that while land availability is not a constraint in Olympia, affordability remains a critical issue. Olympia will need approximately 7,600 additional housing units affordable to low-income households. This information has been incorporated into the housing chapter, particularly at the large body of text before the goals and policies. Before I move on and get to the displacement analysis, any questions on the land capacity analysis?
Councilmember Green.
Kate, I just want to make sure I heard you correctly on, so the capacity, the 12,282, you said that's dependent on redevelopment in areas like downtown and the west side?
So if we were to maximize units, yes, we would really have to look at where we can have density and, when you're getting into kind of the nitty-gritty wonkiness of RM24, R4 to 8, things like that, it's dependent on our high-density areas being developed at essentially maximum density. So it's fair to say that our trend typically is we struggle to meet the minimum density for developments. So
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to call that out because I think, I feel like there's an inherent conflict in here when we get into the conversation around maintaining and improving existing low-income housing. I think those are going to be in direct conflict, so thanks.
To some degree, that's true. I think the other thing that the capacity analysis really looks at and tries to identify is adaptive reuse of existing structures. So I know that our housing team and our planning department and building departments are certainly looking at options for adaptive reuse in the downtown. I will say that I've had people ask when is their neighborhood going to be bulldozed? That's by no means the intent or purpose of doing capacity analysis. When we talk about new units, that's where things like middle housing really come into play, accessory dwelling units. It's about putting in units where possible, creating housing in existing neighborhoods, and that has benefit in the sense that we're increasing units in established neighborhoods means you're already utilizing existing infrastructure, roads, sewer systems, utilities, things of that nature. So other redevelopment and potential for increased units, obviously downtown, some of the office buildings that have been vacated by state offices. Other things that you've looked at in the past is Capitol Mall, Triangle sub-area planning, a lot of emphasis on trying to make the underlying zoning more approachable for redevelopment and increasing mixed uses in that area. Again, trying to utilize the existing infrastructure where possible.
Councilmember Cooper, followed by Councilmember Gilman.
Just a little bit of follow-up on that, Casey. Can you just talk about what that means in our traditional or historically traditional single-family neighborhood? So is there any redevelopment at higher density planned in those spaces, or are you really only looking at the current future land use map and not the one we're going to propose in a different chapter?
So I'm not sure I entirely follow that question, council member.
So the vast majority of the city is low density. And
Yes.
so are you redeveloping it into higher density?
I wouldn't say it's going to be changed to higher density. Like I said, most of our low density neighborhoods are well under the minimum density. So they have I would say an abundant capacity. Because like I said, even in our lowest density neighborhoods, most of them, based on some of the analysis that we've done, they're not even meeting minimum density currently.
Yeah, and just to make sure that the buildable land study is based on existing land capacity. So your question around, do they calculate existing single-family zoning for this analysis? And the answer is yes, to determine that initial surplus was based on low density. So rezoning for allowing the middle housing would even increase that. Is that correct?
If we proposed rezoning, but
Yeah.
I don't think we have anything proposed for rezone at a higher density.
Surplus.
Councilmember Gilman.
Thank you, Mayor Payne. Casey, I was just, as you were saying, there was a need of 7,000 low income, at first I'm thinking about the 80 to 100% category, which both has a great need and is still below the halfway mark in our distribution of folks, right? And so my questions, I was reflecting back on the lengthy conversations we had as this study, the housing needs assessment was being conducted. We had the development community saying that affordable housing would only happen with public intervention. And so my question is, that 80 to 100% bracket that we say we have a big need, does that also require public intervention, or are we, because your 7,000 number was above that line. So my question is that still considered housing that needs some public intervention, or do we think that just the market, that it'll pencil out and they'll build the 80% housing?
I don't know that I have the wherewithal to completely answer that, honestly. I would say that when you're getting to the 80 to 100% moderate density, that is getting more towards your market rate mixed family or multifamily
Sure, it's
units.
regular apartments, sure.
Apartments,
Yeah.
some of which might, in order for some of those to occur, to actually pencil, we have had to look at things like the multifamily tax exemption. So in that sense, they have needed assistance to have those projects work.
Thank you. I was just trying to decide where that 80 to 100% fell. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Councilmember Vanderpool.
Yeah, I'm going to ask a question kind of from the other perspective of penciling it out with the private market and thinking about meeting the low-income households. So and meeting the density needs at the same time, right? If you go back one more slide, if we're looking at low income, housing, and you need 30% of $51,000, I don't know anyone in the private market developing that right now, as far as I know in the city. And so I'm wondering, us as a city, how can we be partners to get there, right? I think about that quite often. Is it the permit process? Is it how long it takes? Is it, we've done multifamily tax exemption, we're changing zoning. So I'm just wondering, at the end of the day, the end goal for me as a council member is thinking, how do we get to 30% of $51,000 per unit? That is home ownership and not just rentals.
That's a tough question. There's obvious barriers. I won't even say barriers, but it can be difficult to work through doing a housing development. It has frontage improvements, things of that nature. Getting to the question of providing low-income housing, I don't know a developer that's going to do it at a loss. So I think some of the way we've tried to approach that is some of our partnerships with groups like Low Income Housing Institute and Habitat for Humanity. That being said, it's still challenging even for those nonprofits to make those projects work, because when you're trying to do building in numbers, it requires infrastructure, and infrastructure can be expensive. And as I mentioned at the beginning, materials, even just from my own personal experience, material costs have just exploded, and it's hard to, I don't know what lever we have to make that work.
Yeah, so I mean neither do I. It's more of the end goal that I'm very concerned about along the way. Susan?
Yeah, sorry, I tried to wait for my comment. I think, Councilmember Vanderpool, this is such a complex question. And there's not only variability in a singular site, there's variability in the financing market, there's variability, in housing providers, in federal dollars relative to whether there's HUD funding, whether there's vouchers available, whether there's, so it's really variable. What we're trying to do is, from a city, is how do we set up a framework that will weather that variability? And it's really all about the partnerships, what we can bring to the table as a city. And again, I love that quote on the first slide, that, we can't solely influence the housing market, we can certainly influence it. And so really bringing those partnerships to the table, really recognizing that these are value-based developers. They're in it to provide this gap in our market. So, nope, there's no silver bullet, no
Yeah.
permit waiving, no, singular thing that's gonna tip it over. But I think just the keep trying. We do live in a capital market and not, right, it's unfortunately,
Yeah.
very
I and the other side of that is I'm also, when we're talking about units, I'm also thinking about the complexity of people who are in housing currently that need to downsize or move around in the market. Other factors like that, right? And other factors like people who own land and own a house and want to expand on it, but then the cost is so high for them to do it, or it's too complex and they just avoid doing it entirely, right? And that's a real issue.
Yeah.
So.
I will say that City of Tumwater, I believe it just took on the role of trying to get the pre-made plans for accessory dwelling units. So we're working through that process so that at least in that expense, it's a small part of a large expense, because even an ADU can cost up to $200,000 to build or more. But that being said, I think what I'm hearing there is that you're seeing a change in demographics on who's living where. You certainly have multi-generations in a single house. You have folks aging in place. So I would say that what we're trying to do with the middle housing, Joyce Phillips is working through some updates on the middle housing and infill and trying to lessen some of those, I would say, red tape barriers, as it were. So there is work going on there, but it's a small piece of a really large equation.
Thank you.
City Manager Bernie.
And I'll just lump in there's the work that's at the city level, and then there's the work at the state level too. So, we've seen just here in Olympia that we've had lower income projects not receive funding in a year where we had matching funds ready to fund a project, and because there's just not enough funding at the state level as well. So I think that's the complexity of this. How do we get the 30%, the 80% below and down to 30% is, as Susan said, there's just so many different factors that make that up, and there's not one thing by itself that determines it, that makes it pencil for the developers, either on the private and nonprofit. And even more so, the lower AMI is mostly built by the nonprofit, less so by the for-profit developers. That's a harder nut to crack in most cities.
Thank you. Back to you, Casey.
All right, so the second gap on the commerce checklist for the housing chapter that we are working on and will be our primary topic for this evening is the displacement and racially disparate impacts analysis. For this analysis, Olympia partnered with the cities of Lacey, Tumwater, and Yelm to work with an independent consultant to prepare an analysis and recommendations for each jurisdiction to address these items. While each jurisdiction will have specific recommendations as a deliverable, the intent is to provide a regional look at these impacts. This recognizes that we and our partners do not live in a vacuum, and that addressing these requirements will require time and collaboration across jurisdictional lines. I'd like to offer special thanks to Krista for who took the lead on preparing the RFP on behalf of all the jurisdictions to select the consultant for this study. The partner jurisdictions selected Uncommon Bridges, formerly BDS Planning and Urban Design, for this analysis. So the findings and recommendations will identify policies and regulations that result in racially disparate impacts, displacement, and exclusion in housing, identify and implement policies and regulations to address and undo those impacts, identify areas at higher risk of displacement from market forces that occur with changes to zoning development regulations and capital investments. We'll also help to establish anti-displacement policies. And I don't want to belabor this, but before moving on, I want to be mindful of everyone watching that the next slide includes reference to historic racial covenants, which we've discussed, I think, at length this evening. I'm going to show an example of what that was in our city. It's difficult to read this language, but it's important that we acknowledge this history and contemplate its continued effect on our community. Racial covenants like this existed readily through at least the mid-1950s. In a speech at the Rotary Club, for Olympia, former Washington Secretary of State Ralph Monroe stated that racial barriers were high and hard to break down. Terms like redlining were prevalent in almost every community. Lines were drawn on the map where persons of color could live and where they could not live. The red line in Olympia was basically the city limits. Housing discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin was outlawed with the passage of the Fair Housing Act in 1968. But this did not automatically provide people of color equal access to housing in Thurston County. I highlight this section included in our Housing Action Plan to emphasize the need to complete this displacement study and recognize that Olympia has a very real history in discriminatory housing practices. I will also state that anecdotally, I've had people ask me, why are we doing this study? It's not one, it's multiple members of our community have asked, what is the point of this? So I highlight this as why. So, the Washington State Department of Commerce generally defines displacement under 3 categories: economic displacement, physical displacement, and cultural displacement. Local communities likely experience intersecting factors across all 3 of these categories. Housing displacement risk increases when the population becomes more racially and ethnically diverse. Households are spending more than 30% of their income on housing, which includes utilities, rent, and other needs. Rental units become unaffordable for extremely low-income residents, households, again, earning between 30 and 50% of the area median income. Poverty rates increase in a community, and again, housing displacement risks increase when home ownership rates decline. So, findings from the disparity analysis indicate that Olympia is at an increased risk from physical displacement, displacement as a result of eviction, acquisition, rehabilitation, or demolition of property, or the expiration of covenants on rent or income-restricted housing. While a range of types of housing types exist in Olympia, its displacement risk is uniquely characterized by the loss of existing low-income home ownership alongside a significant challenge in providing affordable rental units for very low-income households. Some data points from the analysis are that there was a significant increase in racial and ethnic diversity among residents between 2010 and 2023. I think, as we heard earlier this evening, when our population of persons of color was near 0, it shouldn't be a surprise that our racial diversity is increasing. Some additional points are a decrease in cost-burdened renter households, but an increase in cost-burdened and severely cost-burdened homeowner households between 2015 and 2021. There was a slight increase in affordable units for extremely low-income households, but a significant decrease in the availability of affordable rental units for very low-income households. Again, that segment between 30 and 50% area median income. There was a notable increase in low-income renters and a decrease in low-income and extremely low-income homeowners in that same time period. There was an increase in overall homeowner households. In preparing their analysis, Uncommon Bridges coordinated 4 affinity group conversations to gather community stakeholders to discuss housing displacement risk in Lacey, Olympia, Tumwater, and Yelm. The affinity group topics included manufactured housing communities, communities of low-wage workers, military families and households, and individuals and companies involved in accessory dwelling units. The bulleted points above are some of the key themes or findings from each of those groups. Regarding, well, I'll move on. I'll pause if there's any questions.
Councilmember Vanderpool.
Can you give us a little more detail? And I know it's in there, but on municipal collaboration, providing housing services beyond what we're currently doing.
I'm sorry, I didn't.
What would be? It says there's a need for collaboration in providing housing services. That's regionally, right? Can you give us an example of that? What that would be beyond what we're currently doing?
So from the analysis and some of the findings, I think a lot of that actually came from our military community, particularly as it revolved around VA home loan services, VA outreach services, and VA emergency services. There is the Lacey Hub, but outside of that, there was concern that the local jurisdictions were so unfamiliar with essentially the Veterans Administration policies. That also translated to difficulties in getting rent and securing apartments based on BAH. So that was one of the findings. I don't know if that's...
Well, it's under communities of low
Right.
wage earners, and that's why I was curious.
And I think, by all means.
So some of this was just directly taken from the affinity groups, and the consultant just reported back on what they heard, and they didn't provide, they didn't ask additional follow-up questions or probing. So some of it we're relying on what they've reported in their affinity group outreach. And I think there was a little bit of additional context in the report that was just, there was a sentiment that the jurisdictions could be working together more effectively so that there was the same level of housing services for a variety of needs at different levels in the community, and just wanting to see more of that. But unfortunately, because staff wasn't part of the affinity groups, we're missing a little bit of context there with some of those comments.
And I think part of the conversation there is also that, these are findings for affinity groups that covered 4 different jurisdictions. When we met with the consultants, part of the conversation was that a lot of the services are actually only in Olympia, whereas if you were in Tumwater, you didn't necessarily have the same level of service or organizations providing these types of services. So that was definitely a part of that conversation as well.
Okay.
Thank you. Casey, I have a question about, you're saying that there's a need for tenant protections to ensure that military households can't be discriminated against. Does that not, and you mentioned BAH, which
Right.
is basic allowance for housing, so it's their mechanism for how they pay.
Correct.
So how is that just not like general employment discrimination?
I don't have a good answer for you there, Mayor, honestly.
Okay.
I think that when you're dealing with rental communities, in a lot of instances, you're at their behest.
I think I did ask for some additional clarification on this from the consultants as well, because the comment was around price fixing. And so my understanding from what I heard was that there's a housing allowance, and some landlords are aware of what those thresholds are, and
It's
they might
set at E5.
set their prices according to that. So while source of income, it's illegal to discriminate based on someone's source of income for paying rent in Washington, they were saying that landlords have some knowledge of what those levels are that people can pay using those allowances.
Yeah, that's public information, so that's easy to figure out.
And that's not unique to Olympia, Lacey by any means.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, Councilmember Madrone.
I had the same question, Mayor, so you got it.
Oh,
You know what, though, while I've, got my mic on, though, I do want to say one thing, though. And, Casey, in a previous slide, you had mentioned that there are people in the community who have asked, why are we even doing this work? And you could have said, because state law requires us to, but instead you gave a really good answer as to why we need to be doing this work, because of our history of intentionally displacing people and not allowing them to live here. So I just want to thank you for that, and just makes me proud to be a council member for the city, to hear staff responding in that way. So thanks for that.
Thank you, council member. All right. So, coming out of this, the consultants on Common Bridges had 4 really broad, overreaching policy recommendations. And when I say policy recommendations, they're more akin to themes that when we're evaluating our housing chapter, we should evaluate our goals and policies based on kind of these generalized bullet points here. Protection and preservation of manufactured home communities, implementing policies to safeguard and preserve manufactured home communities as an affordable housing option within the city. And there's quite a bit of discussion around that. I think it's preservation of existing units and trying to provide utilities and upkeep of those units. Manufactured housing communities, if they're not zoned as such, underlying zoning would otherwise be general commercial or high-density corridor 4. As those communities age and the infrastructure ages, the costs of maintaining those communities becomes significant and difficult, especially when the underlying zoning of general commercial might have a more economic value as another use. Encouraging retention and maintenance of existing affordable housing. As mentioned, we've seen our extremely low housing stock disappear. So developing additional measures to incentivize the retention and maintenance of existing affordable housing units is critical for our low income segment. The second 2 bullets, they're actually coming from our housing action plan. They evaluated those as high impact strategies that align to overcome housing barriers in our community. So evaluation of the home fund relationship, again, that's really looking at our home fund and making sure that it's in sync with the Thurston County home fund, which are separate entities but working in partnership. And then expanding residential tenant improvement allowances. Broadening the allowance for residential tenant improvements without triggering additional land use review requirements. This could encourage the maintenance of upgrading of existing housing stock. So again, that's already outlined in our housing action plan. We're trying to take those steps already. The analysis concludes by pointing towards a need for encouraging the retention and maintenance of existing affordable housing stock. Expanding the allowance for residential tenant improvements. I think I'm repeating myself. So, new and or existing goals and policies will be revised to reflect these priorities as directed by the report and also by you, City Council members. Which leads us to, yes.
Do we already have a policy track going for manufactured home? Like, is there even a referral or anything in the hopper working on the implementation of this?
So I think at our March study session, I reported about some possible manufactured home policies. And then next month at the July 15th study session, I'll follow up on some of the state legislation that passed, and then we can talk about some of the next steps that could take place with manufactured home policies.
So you're just doing it concurrent with this chapter? Okay,
Yes, so it'll-
Councilmember Madrone.
Yeah, there were some components of the rent stabilization bill that protect manufactured home communities. But I also wanted to highlight that also at the Regional Housing Council, there's been work done in terms of displacement when the land is bought out from under folks. That's what set up an opportunity fund. So if, if we find ourselves in a situation where there is a community that is at imminent threat of being displaced, there is some funding that is potentially available to help them become the owners of the land. But it is a really, really difficult issue to wrap our heads around because, it could happen at any time to any manufactured home community in the county, and there's just not enough resources to be able to help everybody. So, but it has been an ongoing discussion at the Regional Housing Council in terms of like how we can leverage local resources to provide some kind of support. So just wanted to add that in addition to the work that we're doing here at the city.
Thank you. Councilmember Gilman.
If I may, just a little parking lot note on the manufactured housing. It would be great when you report back next to get the percent that are on sewer. That the septic crisis, closing down a small park has been an issue a couple times. We've used community development block grant to stabilize that community. But it would just be good to know where we're at. There's only, at least when we did the housing needs assessment, there were 650 units. It's not a lot of units, and hopefully we can know which still are on septic, and that might be either us or LOT doing an intervention to help stabilize those communities.
Yes, Councilmember Cooper.
Would you currently be able to build a new manufactured home facility in our community? I'm on the Housing Authority Board, and we weren't able to do one in Tumwater with their current codes.
So manufactured homes are allowed in any residential district. So they have to be built on a slab, basically to building code. So a manufactured home is allowed. A manufactured home community, that's slightly different. They have different connections. They don't necessarily have a foundation. We have a specific MHP zone, manufactured home park zone, that is limited, and it's really just for existing communities. Other manufactured home parks that are in the HDC or general commercial, most of these communities predate, I would say, even the GMA, the Growth Management Act. The communities predate the majority of our code. So if you were to try to do a new manufactured home park, you would not be able to do it in the general commercial or HDC4. Our code says that it's allowed if it's existing. We have MHP zoning, but those zones are already encompassed or occupied by existing communities. So yes, but no. I mean, I'm not trying to be flippant by any means, but that is what the code says.
I really appreciate how thorough you answer that, because I think that's where the price point lies. Like, we designed our own on city property and tried to do a grant for one, and I think we need to make sure that our goals are setting us up for new modern housing that comes out of a factory, whether it's on a single family lot or in a community, on a multifamily lot. Reframe the name of what we're talking about, right?
And you could certainly do manufactured homes in like a new development. So the code is really specific on what a manufactured home community is. So again, that's kind of, you have the lot, it might be under single or communal ownership, and then the actual housing unit is not necessarily permanent or tied to that parcel. Usually it's leased or rented. So that's a manufactured house community. Whereas manufactured homes, when they're built, they can be built anywhere. You could have a brand new development, cul-de-sac, all manufactured homes. We would treat them the same as stick-built, essentially. Correct. They would be allowed to have ADUs. They could be a duplex manufactured home, rare, but it's out there. So there are things like that, and we do allow that. So it's whether or not it's that kind of leased land community, which generally it would be difficult to do under our current code again.
Councilmember Gilman.
So since Councilmember Cooper made my night with the community reinvestment plan thing, I'm going to make him super happy and tell him that part of the missing middle updates, our harmonization work, is that several cities have been working on tiny houses on wheels and how do those fit. And it happens to be the same language as this question of a manufactured home on a house foundation versus on a slab. So there is work that Joyce Phillips is conducting right now in the harmonization that will redefine somewhere between cluster housing, tiny house community, emergency, because we have all these gray categories right now, and the legislature made some attempts, and we're going to try to clean it up. And anyhow, I think that there is a future for modular or manufactured or tiny houses as communities, and there are several cities that are trying to write ordinances to allow that right now. So.
And that's something that's come up for us in the past. We've had, do I need to stop? No, I was trying not to We have encountered folks that want to do tiny homes on wheels. Basically, the state law and code treats that as an RV. So tiny homes on wheels have to have basically a license through labor and industry. So you're absolutely correct. Joyce is working on that. We've got a couple local jurisdictions that we've looked to fix that. So.
Councilmember Vanderpool.
This is a very specific and very small question. Please don't jump out of your seat. I have additional question about this. So would we be allowing it in a lot splitting situation with some of the code updates? Would this be like, so if you wanted to build manufacturing and you own a parcel, or you own one of these larger parcels that the park's on, and you want to just lot split it for ownership purposes, or just lot split it in general off your parcel, would this coincide with the lot splitting rules that are coming down from the state?
Yes, it would potentially. So that's state law. There are a number of different ways you could do the lot splitting. So it could potentially be a tiny home on wheels. It could potentially be a manufactured home. So the state law doesn't preclude that, and our code wouldn't necessarily preclude. I'll put tiny homes on wheels separate. We're working on that separately, but like manufactured home or anything that you're kind of referring to, yes, the lot splitting would technically allow it based on our engineering design standards. As long as it meets our EDS, lot splitting has a lot of variability and flexibility on what we could do.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, I think it's finally back.
Mr. Mayor, could we give Susan a brief opportunity? She's been just bursting to share the conversation.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yes. Susan,
Thank
please.
you so much, Mayor and Council. In all honesty, this is such an interesting topic, and we had a staff meeting around this just last week, and it's pretty fascinating to unpack. So I couldn't help myself, clearly. But what I wanted to say is the vulnerability and these manufactured home parks is really around the lack of home ownership. And so the topic around how we can maintain their asset and give them opportunity to home ownership through, I think, through the ADU path of conduitization or lot splitting with the new middle housing legislation. Pretty fascinating to think about relocation of existing manufactured home parks if that comes to be, because the reality is that infrastructure is a good thing, for environmental reasons, for social reasons, for connectivity. And so really when you think about modernizing and thinking about future forward resilience, it's in our collective best interest to see how these evolve in a really sensitive way that maintains their assets. So I just wanted to offer that up. That's the line of thinking, and we look forward to the study session where we can dive into this more.
Thank you. Okay, now I think you can move on with the presentation.
All right, I'll try to wrap up here. So the analysis report concludes an evaluation table that assesses the existing comprehensive plans, goals, and policies for impacts for racially disparate impacts, including displacement and exclusion. The evaluation used these criteria here in evaluating each goal and policy, consistent with the Department of Commerce's racially disparate impacts guidance. In the next draft that I'm hoping to bring to land use and environment, I believe on July 10th, I will be especially focused on updating the policies and goals identified as challenging. And those are defined as the policy may challenge the jurisdiction's ability to meet the identified housing needs. The policy's benefits and burdens should be reviewed to optimize the ability to meet the policy's objectives while improving the equitable distribution of benefits and burdens imposed by the policy. So I already have started a table that includes all of our challenging policies. I'm somewhat happy to say that it's a short list overall. One of the policies we actually already identified as being stricken from our comprehensive plan. So the housing element overlaps significantly with the land use chapter. The housing displacement analysis identifies a number of policies under the land use chapter with suggested revisions as well. This analysis has been shared with David Ginther, who is the lead on the land use chapter, and he is working to incorporate these findings in that chapter as well. So this is an example. In updating the policies and goals, special attention, as I mentioned, will be paid to those that are identified as challenging. The language will be reviewed as recommended or outright removed. So, for example, this policy currently is proposed to be removed from the housing chapter. I would also note that when you're looking at this table, the goal and policy numbers have changed. So if you're having difficulty looking at this table as provided in the displacement analysis, those policies and goals might not align because the housing chapter was being worked on. So when we combined those policies and goals, the displacement analysis was happening concurrently. So it's a little wonky, but I just want to be clear that if you're having difficulty finding that, they are evaluated, they are there. So we'll be going through, we'll also be looking at obviously those policies and goals that are approaching and trying to revise those as well. So that's based on our existing policies and goals. So where are those existing policies and goals coming from? Again, a little bit of review. While the housing chapter itself is new for Olympia's comprehensive plan, a majority of the goals and policies come from the land use and the public services chapter. Public services chapter is now the public safety chapter, which you have reviewed once and will be reviewing again, I believe, on July 15th. Some of those goals and policies already reflect minor changes, and you may note that the draft housing displacement has some further recommendations. As mentioned already, we'll be updating this draft. Hopefully, not hopefully, you'll have a revised draft by July 10th. Hopefully incorporating all these changes as well as any that might be up for discussion this evening. So the most significant update is going to come from our housing protections. So aside from combining the goals and policies from the land use and the former public services chapter, the most significant changes relate to housing protections identified in the Housing Action Plan. Many of these are already being implemented programmatically. So in a sense, this is really the comprehensive plan catching up to the work that's being done now and over the past few years. So this goal is new to the chapter, and it is supported by, I think it was seven individual policies related to tenant protections and renter assistance and protection policies. So I would, again, call out Krista and her team, Jacinda and everyone in the housing team that's been working through all of that work. Jody as well with renter protections. Sarah, excuse me. So, like I said, a lot of that work is already happening. We're really just catching up to that work. So, next steps. As I mentioned, aiming to have a revised draft, we'll have a revised draft, including displacement analysis recommendations in time for Land Use and Environment Committee on July 10th. We've got additional briefings coming up for Planning Commission, and we're aiming for the Planning Commission public hearing by August 4th, and then bringing it back to Land Use and Environment on August 28th. And then we'll have this back before you, the chapter as a whole, for review, a study session on September 16th. So the questions we're here to ask you this evening are: what is missing? What needs additional clarification or attention? And is this on the right path for community needs? I think I can speak for Chris and I both, based on the previous agenda item and discussion. I think we both wrote down a number of notes on language for generational wealth, for basically addressing injustice, because I hate to admit that I don't know that our chapter currently has language that really addresses that. It's a shortfall at this point, right off the bat, that I think we know is there. So I think we'll be going back to look at additional goals and policies to really address that. So with that being said, happy to answer any questions, happy to take any and all comments and direction on this. And again, just want to thank Krista for her work on making this analysis happen, and for the support that she's offered to not just City of Olympia, but also our partner jurisdictions. And also a thanks to our partner jurisdictions that have brought a lot of unique perspectives to the conversation, and also to Uncommon Bridges. They couldn't be here tonight. If you have questions for them, they have committed to coming to a future study session if you would like to ask them directly about the displacement analysis. So, Krista, anything you would like to add?
No, I don't think so. Thank you. And thanks, Casey, taking the lead.
All right, well, thank you both. Casey, I appreciate you. Sounds like you obviously were listening in on that, but just to kind of piggyback off of what you just mentioned around that. So the way I'm thinking about it is adopting home ownership goals that are data informed for Black residents, and then also with a goal of working towards achieving those goals. I think that's an important thing that needs to be clarified, because it's one thing to establish the goal and it's another thing to actually do the work to get there. Which is something that I do see as like, it's broader to our equity, our more broad equity goals. So bridging that connection as well. I have, obviously in the context of reparations, we're talking about that for the descendants of enslaved people and African Americans. But I would imagine that could also be applicable to other demographics as well. So if we know that there are disparities within race more broadly, we should be looking at that too, and doing the same. I had a question though about, one second. So in the physical displacement section for Olympia, there was an interesting point in here that I read that said, it's possible that once homeowners have become economically forced to become renters, thus putting a strain on the availability of rental units. And I thought that was an interesting take, because we think of the transition from renter to homeowner, but we don't think about often, going from homeowner to renter. And do we have an understanding of that picture for our city?
Short answer from me is no. I would have to go back and look at additional data. I will say that part of the discussion, even with Uncommon Bridges, around some of our data, especially as it related to census data, recent information is spotty at best. The 2020 census data was fairly incomplete. So looking at data within the last 5 years that is current was really problematic. It was one of the major challenges for this analysis. So in looking at that kind of data of homeowner to renter, I'm not aware of a data point on that. I don't know if you are. we might be able to reach out to TRPC, our colleagues over there, Thurston Regional Planning Council. That might be a data point that they have, and it's certainly something we could look into.
Yeah, I think that we don't have good information currently about that. I think like one potential source would be like foreclosure resources at the state level. And so that's something we could look into further, but I'm guessing there's also a lot of situations where people might sell also where we wouldn't know that was the result. But the foreclosure data is something that would be a little bit more easily obtainable, I think.
Yeah, that's helpful, because I think in this context, we're talking about people that are, economically burdened. And so if we're not monitoring that, or if we're not aware of the fact that maybe our homeowners are having issues or difficulty, and then it becomes too late for us to try to address that if we're not monitoring it. So just something to think about, just in terms of our intent with establishing, again, back to goals. Maybe that's another one we need to have, so that we're paying attention to that trend if it exists. Yeah. Councilmember Green.
Yeah. I know, Casey, you said that Uncommon Bridges couldn't be here, so if this is a question, I just need to email for their feedback. There is a paragraph in the portion where they're talking about specifically Olympia, or in that section. There's a paragraph that, I'll be honest, I just could not decipher, and I would love to understand better. And it says, the city has already expended considerable political capital enacting multi-part strategies to address housing affordability, and kind of goes on from there. Is that referencing something specific, or I just couldn't really make heads or tails of what they were trying to say there?
No, I think we did have some conversations with the consultant about some of that, and I think, especially in the first iteration of the analysis, it didn't look at our housing action plan, and it didn't look at the complete picture of the work we were doing. They looked only at the land use chapter initially. So we responded that there was a breadth of work that they either didn't know about or didn't incorporate into the analysis. So if I had to venture a guess, that paragraph is a direct response to us saying, you have some additional things to evaluate before you can provide this analysis.
Thank you.
Any additional questions? Councilmember Gilman.
First, I want to appreciate the recommendation about modifying the requirement for what sort of repairs on a home could be done that are sort of either below permit or below land use review. Because as a carpenter, it's something that comes up pretty often. Like, can you fix my railing? Well, let's look at what's your railing situation, right? And I think that we've had a very restrictive, essentially you can replace a broken window with the identical window, and not a whole lot more. There's not very many repairs that can be done that don't require reviews. And I know it's for good reason, but maybe if we back up some of those work on an individual's residence that aren't health or safety, seismic sorts of concerns, that looks like a place where I think there's some room, and I don't know what building code guidance we might have, but I'm intrigued that that's a finding, because that's an experience I have pretty often about, isn't this just something you can come do on Sunday? I'm like, that's like coming and bulldozing land on Sunday. I can't do that, It's like, anyhow, and then the other thing that'd be really helpful for me is that a lot of this is, that this analysis is, anecdotal is not the right word. It's not very empirical. And I know it's an ongoing challenge to figure out the universe, but I'm super interested in, like Krista and I had an exchange today that TRPC's housing needs assessment had quite different numbers, even though, and it was like 4 years ago, but it still has substantially different numbers of multifamily units than the base number that we're working towards with the rental registry program. And so I think that warrants, there's enough variability in the different estimates, and HUD also has a 2020 assessment of our metro area that has yet another set. So having a number that we're comfortable with of what are the numbers, and then also I think we used to have community members who took quarter by quarter the real estate transactions at the county. And we're having a lot of we were having them at dinner, anecdotal conversations about either people are having a mass exodus of selling their rental properties because they don't like our policies, or they aren't. But that's something that the county assessor can provide, is the transactions and what are the addresses, at least the city of the people who are purchasing the houses, so that we have some sense of how much flow and what's the ultimate output of those transactions. Because I just think that would help me to think about displacement if I knew whether or not there's a shift in single-family homes that have been rentals in their ownership, and what's the total universe of rentals, especially multifamily, compared to the smaller infill fourplex and less that we have as separate goals and separate buckets of interest here. So I know it's always challenging, and we hope that TRPC or the census has it ready to go, and so far it's been hard to get satisfaction that way. So I'll just offer that. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for that. That would answer a lot of questions, I think, provide a lot of clarity around what's happening with our rental registry. Additional questions, Councilmember Madrone.
Yeah, I just have like kind of a high level comment on the draft chapter, and that's to just kind of check with where we are with what's currently written. I kind of give it a quick look through, knowing that it's coming back to the Land Use Committee twice. But one of the things that I saw is, around extended notice for notifying of rent increases, of at least 90 days, and that, we're a bit beyond that here in Olympia. So that was just one thing where I was just like, okay, well, is that what we want to have, or do we want to have it, say where we're already at, and I think state law now requires that anyway, so why have it in our plan? And another one that stood out to me was like around co-living spaces being in like high density commercial, pretty much anywhere but low density areas, and I'm actually not 100% clear on the status of where we're at with that. I know that there's some state law that has changed that I think is part of the middle housing update that Joyce is working through, but I think that we would like to see co-living spaces all over the city and not just limited to certain areas that aren't the lower density residential spots. So that was just two things that I noted in there as I was going through it quickly. So just a review in terms of like, what it says now and, how we've evolved as a city since, some of those things were originally thought of, or just checking for consistency in that regard.
All right, additional questions? I don't know about you all, but I need to stretch my legs, and my watch is yelling at me. All right, well, thank you, Casey and Krista and Susan. Thank you for your input and for your work. And Krista, I'm going to take this moment to thank you for your work on the Black Home Initiative, and I know that you've done quite a bit of work in terms of engaging with the private partners and, meeting with folks, bringing folks together in effort for us to join. So I just thank you for all the work you've done in that space.
Thank you. Yeah, I did want to just give a quick update because it's relevant to this conversation. But we, as the Thurston kind of regional collaborative, have started having discussions about setting goals. So it's kind of timely to what we were talking about today. And we can do that separate for the city of Olympia, but just wanted to let you know that I'll keep you all posted if, as I have updates with that as well.
Okay. Yeah. Well, hopefully there's something to learn there from their methodology or their approach and how they're determining that. Yeah. Thanks. All right, well, it is now 8:28, and we are going to recess for 5 minutes. Okay, and so we are back, and we're going to move on to our final agenda item on our agenda tonight, which is item 2C, the budget sustainability and the city's approach to balancing the 2026 operating budget. And we have our city manager, Jay Burney, presenting.
Good evening, Mayor, council members. For the record, Jay Burney, City Manager. Tonight, we're going to continue a discussion that we started at your mid-year retreat around budget sustainability. And specifically tonight, there was one portion we didn't have time to get to at your mid-year retreat, which is to get your feedback on an approach for addressing reductions, should we need to pursue them to any degree to balance the 2026 budget. We'll look at our current financial position. I'll review some of the short-term and long-term approaches we discussed at your mid-year retreat, and then we'll dig into our discussion around a shared approach to guidelines for any potential reductions. Before we get into our discussion around reductions, though, I want to quickly review some of the alternatives to reductions we discussed at the retreat, alternatives that could help us both in the short term and the long term. We're not going to go into any in-depth conversation on any of those because we did that at your retreat, but just for the larger community that didn't get to see and have benefit to seeing some of those, I want to just go through them real quick. And it's important for the community and our employees to see that we do have several solid options that we're working towards that it gives us a start. And just to level set, and council's seen this many times, but for those watching at home, we balanced our 2025 budget utilizing $4 million in reserves, meaning that at a minimum, we start our 2026 balancing $4 million in the hole before we add in the cost of benefits, insurance, and salaries. So just again, $4 million is just a starting point. And our current fund balance is sitting at $14.3 million, and $2.8 million of that is what is above the 10% minimum established by policy. But again, our fund balance policy is to be between 10% and 25%, and we're sitting at 12.5% right now. The good news as we start this conversation is the E-team and I got started on our 2026 budget work about a month ago, and we sat and developed some ideas and concepts to help balance in 2026. And we developed a list of up to $11.7 million in ideas and thoughts, which we presented to you at your retreat. And again, I'm just going to roll through some of these as we already discussed these a bit at your retreat, and I've already received some preliminary feedback. So in terms of some short-term consideration, some of these are ones that we're going to benefit from without doing anything. So for example, the first one is the state is going to decrease our contribution rate for two of our retirement plans, PERS and PSERS, which PSERS is a public safety, and then PERS is just a more general public employees retirement system that most of our employees are part of. Our contribution rates are going down, and that usually happens when those boards feel like the fund balance within those retirement funds are at a rate that's sustainable, and our rates can fluctuate up and down. But our rates for the next year are going down, and that's going to save us about $1.6 million, and it's July to June. So you'll see half of that reflected here because you're going to receive some of that savings in the balance of this year, and the balance of it you'll receive January to June of next year. We could do some things like temporary reducing indirect charges, delays of street striping. We could temporarily transfer some capital dollars to fund operational expenses and transportation. And I mentioned to you, part of that is some of our funding that relies on state match was pushed out past 2030 horizon, which creates some opportunities. And you always have at your disposal exigent financial circumstances in parks, which you could declare, which dedicates a portion of parks capital to your operating. We've only done that one time. We did it during COVID, is the one time we did it, and we did pay it back, although there's not a requirement to do so. And then some longer term things that we've been discussing is we have a 0.5% of the 1% non-voter utility tax that was dedicated to parks. Both that 1% is in two chunks. The first 0.5% comes back to you this year, and then you have a second 0.5% that's another $500,000 that returns to the general fund in after 2029. We've also been having a conversation around B&O and based on kind of moving to a 2/10 and a $500,000 and raising the threshold for payment to $500,000 that could generate up to $2.3 million in new revenue for the city. House Bill 2015 is a new councilmanic 1/10 of 1% sales tax that you could implement. That's about $3 million for the city of Olympia if you implemented that. There is some timelines associated with that. The county has an opportunity to go first before we do. There's some very specific criteria that we have to meet around state mandated training for our law enforcement. And I'll just say, I had a good conversation with Interim Chief Parker today, and our preliminary analysis is we meet the majority of those requirements. So, but timing of this, it's $3 million, but it may not be something we can implement January 1st for 2026. It may be something that comes later. And it's still a conversation we'll have to have with the council later about whether the timing is right to implement. And I see a question here.
Councilmember Vanderpool.
I know the answer to this, but I want, for the public record, I just want to ask this. So the House Bill 2015, that would also include some of the stuff that we do specifically as a city, like crisis response unit and all those other things that exist
Yep.
at the police department that would still help with that funding.
Yeah, thank you. So I think a lot of us think of frontline public safety. That is true, but it does fund alternative programs like crisis response units, like homeless response is another public safety function that this funding could cover.
Okay, thank you.
So thank you for that.
Yes. Jay, I have a question really quick too on that one about the estimate of $3 million. So if the county goes first, is there an impact to the estimate that we could generate?
No, we still get our share.
Okay.
So it's just the county gets a chance to go, and if they go, then we get lumped in with theirs, and we pull our share out of theirs. Versus if they choose not to go, then we go.
I see. Okay. Thank you.
And then we have some other things that we're kicking around, moving to a lease model on some of our passenger vehicles, not our heavy duty vehicles, but our light duty vehicles. It's here in the long term because in 2026, we looked at the vehicles that are available. And if we did just those vehicles, that's about a $500,000 savings in 2026. But most of these are one time. So as we phase to a leased approach, we get to recoup the money that was paid in to the vehicle replacement fund, but once you reclaim it once, you don't get to reclaim it ongoing. So this is more of a one-time, but again, it's in long-term because you wouldn't do it all in 1 year. You do it over time as vehicles are ready to be replaced. I've had a conversation with the finance team about shifting more of an even balance of our climate expenses against the utilities. We've done a look at that, and if we balanced it out a bit further, which I recommend that we do, that could save the general fund about $200,000. There's a small amount of money in transportation reorganization at $40,000. And this last one, I'm going to change the wording on this as you see it in the future, because although last year, as part of balancing our budget, I proposed the elimination of one of the assistant city managers as a way to balance the budget long-term when one of them retires. However, we have another vacant position in the city manager's office, and the conversation I'm going to have between the two assistant city managers, myself, and to some extent council moving forward is, what do we need in the city manager's office to continue to help the council advance its work plan, its priorities? And it's possible we eliminate a different position or we fund things a different way. I still want to account for the $300,000 in savings that was committed to here, but there may be another way to get there. So I'll say that for now and just hold that in your parking lot and we'll have some more conversation about it. But the concept is still there because there's a commitment there. Okay? So again, we're not going to spend a lot of time on that tonight because we did spend some time at your retreat. I took some good notes. I know there are some things on these lists that you just saw that you're not crazy about. And I know there's some things that you're okay exploring a little bit further and you're not willing to take them off the list. So now I'm going to transition to discussing an approach for evaluating reductions. And before we do that, I want to look at the makeup of the general fund and where we took reductions last year, which is things that were in your packet for your retreat as well. As you look at the summary of our general fund, just a few items of note. Of the $114.5 million of general fund that you have, that's the far left column, about $30.5 million of that has offsetting revenues. And so that means that the general fund that's available that we can evaluate for any further reductions is about $83 million. So that's, when we think about taking reductions, it's that pot of money, again, just in the general fund that we can look at in terms of budget balancing. And the other thing I'll just note that really you can see there is that police and fire make up close to half of that $83 million in general fund. So I don't point that out for any other reason that it's significant in our discussion. So when we get to talking about kind of guardrails and considerations, you'll see why that's meaningful. And then looking at where we took reductions, this is just the general fund, so I want to say that. It doesn't include all the positions we reduced, but this is just a summary of what we reduced in the general fund, so you get a sense of which departments took reductions already and what that looks like. And you can see here, Public Works saw the largest share of reductions last year at $600,000, followed by the City Manager Office and Information Services, which is close to $600,000 as well. Any questions on just the background stuff that's here before we kind of get into the meat of our discussion?
I'm not going to get this right, so you might have to help for me, Jay, but can you remind us what the comparison, there was, in the comparable cities analysis, they said we were actually short compared to other cities in growth in a lot of these administrative departments. So can you just reframe that for me so I get it right? Because I think it's important to go with the picture of last year, because that makes us more behind.
Yeah, so what you saw in your retreat in the comparable cities report, and I'll have Debbie jump in here too if I don't get it all right. But one of the things we asked them to look at is how have our support positions grown as our population and our employees have grown. So when I talk about support positions, that's things like human resources, our information services, finance, city attorney's office. Those are all things that I'm probably missing one in there, but strategic communications. Those are all programs that support really all the other programs within the city of Olympia, and they don't work if those programs aren't there to support them. And what we found through the comparable cities is that we don't line up, and we've fallen a bit behind in terms of how we compare to other cities our size. We've recognized that in a few of our budgets kind of moving up to this point. So for example, I think it was 2 years ago, we added an additional resource in the city attorney's office because we recognized as we've got into our housing policy work in particular, it's generated a lot more legal work. And so we added legal staff there. We've added some support positions in other departments over the last few budgets as they've been needed. And again, I think if we did some in-depth work, the one that sticks out to me the most, and not to leave anyone else behind, but human resources in particular has been at the same level of staffing almost the entire time I've been here in 26 years. So it just has not grown at all. And we feel that with 9+ labor contracts, which is far more than we had 10 years ago, and a growing employee base and the need to do more training and more work with our employees is areas that I can just tell you we're falling behind.
Councilmember Madron.
One of the things that I have on my mind is we're going to see a decrease in what is formerly known as the right-of-way funds, which help support some of our administrative and outreach capacity for the housing team. And so, as we're looking forward to the next budget, I assume that these are things that you have on your radar that we should also have on ours. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Thank you. And it's not addressed here, but I thank you for that. So, right-of-way funding went from roughly $9 million down to $5.5 million from the state level. And with that, we're funding most of our sites for the next couple of years with that funding. However, Quinn Street Village, right now, there's some funding at risk there to about $500,000. We'll talk more about that, but there's some funding at risk at Quinn Street Village. And what we've communicated to the state is cities can't live on a year-over-year basis wondering if the state's going to fund those sites. So we have to find a different model, either working with the state or we, as the Regional Housing Council body, have to find a different model for how we're going to fund those sites. Long-term, what we all want to do is build permanent supportive housing. So if I use Franz Anderson Tiny Homes as an example, we've secured funding to build Franz Anderson permanent supportive housing in a partnership with Lehigh. The goal there is you build that housing, then we are able to close the tiny home. Quinn Street's the same thing, we just don't have funding yet. So, but it's going to take us 5 years or longer to build out the housing that just takes the place of the current tiny home and supportive housing that we have now. And so we need a solution that gets us through the next 5 years or longer in particular. So does that help? Did I get at it?
Yeah, and I know it's on your radar. I just want it to be on all of our radars in terms of like thinking about ways in which this budget is going to be harder than the last.
Yeah, we've certainly got some unique circumstances that weren't affecting us last budget that are affecting us now. Just a changing landscape of things. Any other questions, comments?
Well, I'll just add that we also have different options or solutions or potential solutions than we did last time. So I'll just add that also.
That is also true. Yeah, there are a few things that are available to us that we didn't discuss last budget, as we just talked about, that certainly can help us. Okay, we ready to go? So where I want to go tonight is what I'd like to do this evening is get some feedback from the council around considerations for permanent reductions, should we need to take any. I'm interested in what is important to you in terms of how we approach reductions so that we are in sync as we move through the budget process together. And really what I want you to think about is what are the sideboards to any discussion around reductions that you're thinking about. I listed a few here. They all have question marks on them because I'm not putting them up there as ones I'm saying you should or shouldn't do. Some of them, as I go through them, we have done in years past, we've talked about. So they're kind of question marks to get you started in this conversation. What would you change or remove from this list? And then what would you add? What's missing from this conversation? So just a few. We always try to look for revenue offsets and efficiencies. In fact, we always try to consider non-staff reductions first. That's the first thing we try to do. So that's what that first one is look for those things, efficiencies, before we get into any staffing. Last year, we made it a priority to not make any cuts to frontline public safety, particularly police, fire, but I'll add homeless response into that as well. In police and fire in particular, we're already in positions of mandatory overtime in both those groups because of shortages of staffing. We can't hire fast enough, and we've got a lot of hiring underway, but it's going to be tough to make any reductions there. Same thing with homeless response staffing. I'll go far as to say our current level of homeless response staffing isn't adequate, I think, for the level of work that they're asked to do to keep up with. So certainly cutting that further would be difficult to do. But again, question mark. We talked about Tier 2 community priorities last year and trying to stay out of Tier 2 priorities. Public safety and homeless response were two of them. Transportation, climate, economic development were the other community priorities that we tried to stay away from any reductions. And so question mark there, does that still hold true? And then are there levels of services that you're thinking about we should take a look at? Some of those we may, as we look at that first one around efficiencies, we may get at some of that there. And then I just have this other council consideration. So again, I meant this list just to be a starter to get you thinking about it. And I really just am interested in whatever thoughts you have around, again, kind of sideboards to any discussion about reductions. What I don't want to do is bring forward some reductions and have you say, why are we looking at that? Right? And why is that on the list? And so if something like that is front of mind for you, I'd love to hear it.
Councilmember Green.
Yeah, thanks for this, Jay. I'll jump in and say the no cuts to frontline public safety, for me, I would be fully supportive of that. I just can't imagine you could cut all you want, but it doesn't reduce the number of emergencies or so. Yeah.
Any additional questions or comments? Councilmember Madron.
I'd be curious to know, where there are current vacancies within the city, just so that we know what we have to work with that doesn't actually cost somebody their job because there's not somebody currently in it. That being said, sometimes there's a vacancy in a place where we really need somebody there, and I think of, what we were all just talking about, the services that all the departments rely on to do their work that we're, seemingly, understaffed for. We just mentioned HR. I think about Public Works gave up a lot last year. Brought a lot of solutions forward, and so and I also know there was one, I think it was a land use meeting where we were talking with some of the transportation staff in terms of things we would like to do as a council, and they were like, well, wouldn't that be great? And we lost a staff member last year, so really difficult to do the extra things you'd like to do when we're short-staffed as it is, and so that's within the realm of Public Works, and so I kind of flag that just to say for all of us, like as we're talking about where we might be cutting, those expectations that we have, some of the more creative or innovative things we might want to try as a city council become less easy to do. It's really difficult to look at this and be like, oh yeah, that's where the obvious cut is, because we already kind of did that work last year. I am really excited to see what comes out of the priority-based budgeting conversation in terms of where we can find efficiencies just in how we do things. And I kind of mentioned that at the retreat. Where are the areas where we get in our own way, where we could find efficiencies with our own processes and procedures, how many people have to sign a form before the thing gets done. That was my example there. So I'm curious about that. I'm curious about revenue offsets. I'm curious about what does reduced level of service mean? What are some examples of that? I know one example that I can think of off the bat is we no longer have a lobby that's open on Fridays. That's a reduced level of service. So I'm curious about other things that we might do where, where there is might be a new routine that people have to learn, but ultimately not a huge impact to the community. So just some top of line thoughts here. This is, not easy stuff to dig into.
Councilmember Cooper.
Thank you, Mayor Payne. And I think it's important to look at some of the things we've done in the past, in the Great Recession, we cut all of our lobbyists, cut the police auditor. Those are significant reductions in level of service just by losing a contract. And I'm not suggesting I'm not suggesting any of the ones associated with policing, but I think when we talk about discretionary funds, the contractors we use for things that we might be able to do in-house on current FTE, or creative solutions for that. But for me, the couple things that stand out that I would add to this list, the first one is partnerships, and so. The former city manager used to have a slide like this that was spokes on a hub and spoke model, and it had all of these things I think that you mentioned, except the partners and the plus partnerships. So what are organizations or entities that can help us deliver services while meeting broader goals? And I think there's quite a few places across the city that there's probably already suggestions within the priority-based budgeting in that space. I would guess if it's a good data set. And then the thing that really stands out for me right now is transportation. Let's look at where we can go all in on alternative modes of transportation, and maybe we can capture back some pavement money or some other. Because if we create traffic, it will get people out of their car and actually help us accomplish the goal in the long run. But within that, then really specifically in the CFP, how much discretionary money do we have? Because I think that's a dollar figure. And it's still stuck in my head I don't want to come after the transportation program, but when Mark described what would happen if we lost federal funding, I didn't really think it was all that bad. And so can we just put ourselves in that scenario, right? And bring back the funding that's discretionary from the CFP for a couple of years. But the challenge in this exercise is it's great to make a list, but you can't really do it until you have a number.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. I mean, we talked a little bit at the retreat, and we don't really have a number until we get into August. And part of that is because I need for the departments to input their budgets and for the finance team to kind of start to go through them. And then we look at the revenue forecasts, and it's right around mid-August that I get the first look at, like, what is our budget gap, right? And I agree. So it's, it is hard now, but guardrails are important. And I'll just say a couple things, because priority-based budgeting has been mentioned by a couple of you, and I think it'll do two things for us: efficiencies, and then this partnership question. Because the other thing that is really going to help us, it's going to evaluate, is are there other ways to pay for things, or are there other ways that cities get the same service completed? Maybe it doesn't mean that the city's doing it, maybe it means someone else is doing it, right? And so when you talk about partnerships, it likely will point out some of those opportunities for us as well.
Councilmember Gilman.
So I'm thinking about the reductions we did around 2009, and that it was at least 6 or 8 years before things like the multimodal transportation efforts, before having the public works maintenance crews back. I just also want to underscore that if we choose to reduce levels of service and reduce staffing in some of these current departments, we're talking about up to a decade before we would restore that service, let alone augment it. So that's the gravity I see of that choice of reducing service. And I know that it's a three-legged. We have reserves. We have a goal of not going below 10%, but we have reserves. This may be the rainy day. We have some additional revenue possibilities on the list, and we have these reductions to consider. And so I think it's going to be a mix. And I wanted to speak briefly to the public safety staffing, because I feel strongly we're not yet staffed to the level that's in the budget and work plan, to the level that's in our agreements with the labor groups. And I think that's really important to continue to work towards full staffing, because frankly, we get better performance out of our employees if they're not working mandatory overtime and they're not working an uncertain schedule. And we want the best out of those folks that the whole community depends on. I also believe that there's a huge increase in call volume to 911 over the last several years that I wouldn't call it all emergencies that they're responding to. Helping get somebody out of your doorway is important in that moment for that person, but it's not a life safety emergency. And figuring out what are the most efficient and least expensive ways that we help, so that both the fire crews and our patrol officers are not running literally from one call to the next without a lunch break across a whole shift. It's an incredible number of 911 calls. So I think that one of the efficiencies to seek is to try to figure out ways to both help the community seek alternative ways to resolve those situations, and for us to provide an alternative response where possible, so that as we continue to grow this level of officers, we won't have to continually ratchet it up because folks need someone else to open up the window and yell at those kids to get out of there. So anyhow, I just hope that we can continue to address both alternative response and reducing call volume.
Sure, City Manager Bernie.
Just on that response, so one of the things I'll just say is, in the thinking out loud, is I've talked to both chiefs that if I could, I would overhire by several positions in both the police and the fire department. And here's why. Police department in particular, I don't know that we've been fully staffed in probably the last 10 plus years, and only because it's not that we're not trying, it's just that it takes, when someone retires, it's a year to get them replaced. And so I think even if we overhired in police and fire department by several positions, there would be very rare occasions when people are going to be sitting around with nothing to do. I think that's very true. So, it's something as we continue to work towards budget sustainability, I'd like to just put a pin in that, because I'd love to have some future conversations with the council about what that looks like.
Okay, additional questions, Councilmember Madrone, followed by Councilmember Cooper.
He's sitting around with nothing to do. Just kidding. I'm just messing.
He's taking care of us.
I know. I'm hearing a lot that I agree with here. I'm hearing some things that I can live with, such as, some comments around transportation, just recognizing that pulling from capital to operational means that we are, delaying things, and we already have a severely underfunded transportation master plan. The one thing I'm hearing that I don't agree with is dipping into rainy day funds further. We did that last year. We're at 12%, and the governor just announced today that for the revenue forecast for the state for the next 4 years, the legislature over budgeted by $720 million. And so I don't think it's raining yet. I think we see the clouds on the horizon. And so I just wanted to state up front, like, of all the things that we're discussing here tonight, that's the one thing where I just think it would be very, very unwise to dig into our rainy day. And I think we need to figure out how to balance the budget this year, knowing that Medicaid could get cut and suddenly we can't pay for our BLS program. So those are some of the things that are on my mind.
Fair points. Councilmember Cooper.
Yeah, just a couple of additional thoughts. So one is, I think Councilmember Gilman reminded me when I was thinking about capital in the Great Recession, one thing that we did that I wish we hadn't done is not fully funded our building repair and maintenance program, right? Like, so that, that's a place that we want to make sure, I think in my mind, we can handle a little bit of, this is me oversimplifying it, but, reduction in our payment management score, but we can't really handle any sacrifice in our building repair and maintenance at the current moment. And also when Councilmember Gilman was talking, I was thinking about, like, there's a lot of different models out there where 911 systems do a much better job triaging and routing people to different ways of transporting or getting help than an aid car or an ambulance or police department. And maybe that's a place to have a conversation with the whole county about new public safety money is, how can we actually get our call volumes to stabilize and be more focused on the people who need us the most? Because that's a problem countywide.
Yeah, I'm hearing a lot that I agree with tonight amongst all of you. I do share the same concerns about dipping into the rainy day fund. And I also agree with the thought around looking into our transportation that Councilmember Cooper mentioned in terms of, what are the things that are absolutely essential for health and safety in the community, and what are the things that are not, is kind of what I'm thinking when I think about transportation projects. And outside of that, I think there's some space in there where we can consider whether or not things need to proceed at this point. For me, it's safe, clean, green. So anything that touches upon safety for me is a no. We should not be touching any of that. So police, fire, crew, and any of those areas, I think we should not touch. In terms of, economic development, I know there's a lot of debate around whether or not it's, the business of city government and whether or not we should be doing it. But I think we should be doing it. I think it's one of the ways that not only do we generate revenue because of our investments in economic development, but also it's the livability of what economic development does for the community to make people feel a sense of belonging and want to stay and live in the community. So, and I don't think we should underestimate that. Anything really touching upon economic development in the sense of having major impacts to the city in terms of our budget is something I think we should not touch. And just all essential city services. So anything to do with, when people think of municipal government, those basic functions, public works, Councilmember Madrone mentioned they took a lot of hits last year. Any of those things that have to do with, the things people think that we do when they think of the city, we should be prioritizing those things. I'm struggling with the idea that we reduce levels of service because I'm hearing all of the different thoughts around, well, maybe we could just make some tweaks. But if it's just going to put the burden on other employees to do more than one job, and and then for 10 years this person is doing extra duties, or that just puts us further and further behind and contributes to more harm of the city organization. So I'm not a big fan of the idea of reducing levels of service, especially around things that we're supposed to be doing, for the community. And as a resident of the city, if I come into the city, I expect to get help for whatever it is that I need assistance with. And if there's a reduction in that service, then what am I paying taxes for? So I think people are going to want to make sure that we're prioritizing and that we can prevent them from feeling the pain and figure out a way for how we can, be a gatekeeper to some of that until we can't anymore. So yeah, those are just my initial thoughts on our conversation tonight. Yes, Jay.
One more thing I'll add here that is not a bullet on your list, but the mayor brought it up in agenda setting today, and we were talking about it, is options. So, I presented some short-term, long-term considerations around revenues, and you all had asked for options for your consideration. So what that might look like is, so I'll just use as an example, we may come to the point where we need to identify $500,000 in reductions. And I may bring you $1 million so that you can look at what's there and you can help decide of that what's part of what you want to cut within that $500,000 to get there. And so that you're part of that conversation. I clearly heard that from several of you last year, and so that's how I'll proceed this year in looking at giving you options for your consideration, so you're more a part of that conversation.
Thank you, Jay. Councilmember Madrone.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Jay, so that we can weigh in on, like I said, looking at this list, like none of these there's no clear yes, right? So it's all about the pros and cons of what we keep and what we don't. So that's good for us as a council to go through that exercise. And I think the public also needs to see us go through it and see us make these tough decisions that we have in front of us, so that they understand all the things that we're weighing too, and they can be a witness to that we're not just taking what's put in front of us, that we're really critically thinking about it and thinking about the impacts to them.
Councilmember Vanderpool.
Yeah, I've been just observing, listening. I honestly don't feel comfortable having a conversation about a lot of this until I see priority-based budgeting. I know that takes a little bit more time, but because I honestly don't want to cut any of these things. I'm nervous about a lot of that. I see in the future, for example, if I ask a member of the community what the priority is, it's going to depend on who I'm talking to, right? Some people are going to feel that we need more sidewalks, and some people feel that we need just police and fire. And so without more information, it makes it harder for me to make a decision on this, right? Having the options, I agree, will help us, but I feel dually nervous about making decisions like this on stuff that frankly could put us behind, let's say, and I'm listening to about the last time we had to make cuts in the recession, and I think about like losing people that have institutional knowledge and background and putting us in a position where we're not able to work on certain things. But I did hear one other thing in here that I made note of is the partnerships that Councilmember Cooper mentioned, right? So the example of our sidewalk program, right? Sidewalk repair versus installing sidewalks. How do we work regionally with our neighboring jurisdictions to cover that need in the meantime while the public expects us to do something with that funding that we just keep building up? So there's things like that I think we can do while we're going through this to continue to meet the needs of the public. But I do want to know where we are. Once we look at all those revenue options, particularly like the House bill, where would we be if we implemented and used that money, like just letting me know where we are? Because we could be really close or we can be really far, and I'm not sure right now.
Well, let me give you some hope here in this conversation, because I think there's a lot of it. And, as I have looked at my whiteboard and I've really thought about the path here, in those, if you go back, and I won't tonight, but in those short-term, long-term, I can get to $6 million of options there. Not all revenue, some of them are offsets, like the $200,000 offset for climate, right? There's some real options there that are, I think, fairly easy for us to consider and get to. That closes some of the gap and then a little bit more, right? I don't think we're at a year this year that looks like last year in the volume of reductions we had to take and staffing levels. I don't at all. And so I just want to say that out loud for staff and for the community and for the council. It's not where I think we are. I think we did the work we needed to do last year. We made some really hard decisions last year to start to get us closer to budget sustainability. We all knew this wasn't done last year, and it's a work in progress. And we're going to continue to take another bite. And some of the revenue options that we're looking at this year weren't part of our discussion last year. And some of the things like $1.6 million in reductions to PERS weren't part of our conversation last year, right? In fact, they went up last year. So there is some hope in this conversation. And I do think we're going to be at a different place in terms of our conversation. I'm certainly not going to say this is going to be easy and we've got it solved. But I do want you to leave tonight feeling hopeful about our conversation as we move through the budget process, because I very much am hopeful in our budget conversation as we move into it this year.
Great. Thank you. Jay, I have a question for you. Do you feel like you have what you need from this conversation? Is this what you expected to hear?
It is. I appreciate it. I got a lot of good nuggets here, and I'm hearing the concern as well. And so Debbie and I will, and Mike, I should say Mike and Joan, and they're here as well. Your finance team's here as well. And as Mike gets his feet under him, you're going to see a little more of Mike in these conversations, a little less of Jay in these conversations as we continue to move forward. So I appreciate having him here as he gains his footing, and it's really important for him to hear this, because Mike also brings a depth and breadth of background that we also will benefit from, along with Joan and her team. So we got a great team working on this. So I just want to say that out loud. But yes, I have it. We'll pull all this together, our thoughts of what we heard. We'll reflect this back to you as we continue to move through the budget process. But I've got what I need for tonight if you feel like you've got it out.
Okay. All right, it's getting late. Does anybody have anything burning that they just have to share before we recess? Okay. All right, well, thank you, Jay.
Thank you.
Okay, so at this time, we are going to recess for 5 minutes, and then we will reconvene in room 423 for a closed session pursuant to labor negotiations for up to 60 minutes. No decisions will be made, after which we will be adjourned for tonight.